All right, so I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon, and welcome everyone. This is very exciting. My name is Ugur Cetintemel. If you're from the Stone Age or Iron Age, you may not know me because I started in 2001. I'm the department chair, and yes, you're still in the right place. This is computer science, not Middle East studies, so don't leave. Today is an exciting day where we're going to be celebrating our people, especially our undergraduates, our alumni, and a truly gifted individual and a great researcher and educator, Endo and them. So you may not know about this, but this year is also Brown's 250th anniversary. And to be honest with you, I was a bit disappointed when I heard that Andy has been here for only 50 years, because I thought he founded Brown. Evidently, he just founded CS. So while we are looking back with pride, we are also moving ahead with excitement, because it's really an exciting time to be doing computer science. There are so many opportunities, there's a lot of interest and ways to make impact through the use of computing and information technology. We are fortunate to have a very supportive senior administration behind us at this point in time. Our president and the provost will be here. They're going to be making remarks highlighting the importance of CS to the world, to Brown, and give us exciting news and plans about Brown and computer science. Related to that, one of our goals, starting with this event, is to try to better engage with our alumni. We would like to hold events like this, very alumni-oriented, both here on the East Coast as well as on the West Coast, to engage with our alumni better, but also let them engage with each other, especially across generations, as the kind you're going to see here. Before I finish, I'd like to thank a couple of people for the role that they played in the organization of this event. I'd like to thank especially Lauren Clark and Jesse Polhemus, who did an amazing job. I would like to thank Tom Doeppner, who, as always, pulled a lot of the weight, and he doesn't need an introduction. Thank you, Tom. And I would like to thank Andy, who actually worked really hard to organize this event. And for people who know Andy, this shouldn't come as a surprise. So welcome. Thanks for attending, especially our speakers. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Hope you enjoy the event and also stay for the commencement weekend. Thanks.
So welcome to Celebrate with Andy. We're celebrating not just 50 years of Andy Van Dam at Brown, but 50 years of computer science at Brown. And please note, this is neither a retirement party nor a wake. We all expect to see Andy in the classroom next year, and who knows for how many succeeding years. This afternoon, you'll hear about Andy in the department from many of his former students, and you'll hear from our president and our provost. But I'm going to begin with a brief history of the CS department at Brown from the point of view of a faculty member who hasn't been here nearly as long as Andy has. I hasten to point out that I was starting high school when Andy joined the Brown faculty. So, it's 1965. Ed White conducts the first spacewalk. Muhammad Ali knocks out Sonny Liston. Lyndon Johnson starts his first full term as president. The Rolling Stones go on a world tour. And Andy Van Dam joins the Brown faculty. It's now 2015, and with the possible exception of the Stones, Andy is the only one who's still at it. So let's go back to the early years. Andy started at Applied Math at Brown since there wasn't a CS department at the time. Here's Andy at an IBM 2250 graphics display, a rather rare type of hardware at the time, and it was expensive. It sold for $250,000. After doing early work in stereoscopic graphics with his PhD student, the late Charles Strauss, Andy got intrigued with hypertext after a chance meeting with Ted Nelson. He produced a system called HESS, Hypertext Editing System, that had some success, including being used by NASA to produce documentation that was sent into space with the Apollo astronauts. He and his students later produced the even more successful system FRESS, which is used at Brown and elsewhere into the 80s. He's continued his work on text and document processing throughout his 50 years at Brown. He's also been active in a number of other areas, which we won't have time to get into. Now, the Brown course catalog is the official record of courses at Brown, or at least it used to be. We can't afford to produce them anymore. But here's the first appearance of Andy's name in a Brown course catalog. This one is from 66-68. And Applied Math 101 and 102, he taught essentially all of computer science, except with the possible exception of AI and databases. Andy was soon joined by another faculty member. John Savage joined Brown a year after Andy did. The first CS-related course that John taught was Engine 164 on computer architecture. Here's his debut in the Brown catalog. Peter Wegner joined the faculty in applied math in 1969. This is from the 1977-79 catalog, in which Steve Rice and I make our debut. Despite the fact that we're still split between applied math and engineering, we finally get to call all our courses CS courses. If you look here at the top, CS 50 is the forerunner of today's CS 4. 51 begat 11, which begat 15. 100 was ultimately replaced with 16 and 31, which ultimately became 33. 101 became 32. And 104 became 167 and 169. Of course, I've taught every year since started it in the spring of 77. So, applied math and engineering were, to put it mildly, not excited about seeing us break away. I won't go into the details, but a lot of somewhat heated discussion took place before it happened. At first, we were declared a program in computer science, so that we officially were still in either applied math or engineering. But in '79, we did break away, and Andy became the first chair of the new CS department. We moved to our own building, which was our home until '88, that was enlarged in '82 with the addition of Gould Lab and the Foxborough Auditorium. Here's a photo of that building, Kassar House, which was renovated for us under the supervision of John Savage, who was the acting director of the program while Andy was away on sabbatical. Here we all are in the summer of '79 when the department was founded. Bob Sedgwick, a student of Andy's who was also a founding faculty member, subsequently left for Princeton. But the problem I have with this photo is that one of our seniors mentioned to me a couple months ago that she saw in the Sun Lab this old photo of Andy with a bunch of other people she didn't recognize. Who were these other people? So, for Bela's sake, we retook this photo a week ago. Okay. Here we are, 36 years later, and we didn't even get it in color. Okay. So, the 1980s began with a truly important series of grants. The first funded the equipment for our computer classroom, then called the Cause Lab. The next bought us the equipment necessary for a research-oriented CS department. And the third funded much of the research work that used this equipment. Putting these grant proposals together was a major department-wide effort. We worked on them until the last possible moment. Though FedEx existed back then, Adobe had not yet invented PDF. So thus, grant proposals involved large amounts of paper that had to be transported to Washington. One of our PhD students, Dick Bolterman, was a private pilot. For the first of these proposals, we commissioned him, along with another student, to fly our proposal to Washington and hand-deliver it, thus allowing us to continue working on it until the morning of the day it was due. We thought this was a bit risky for the next proposal. So for that, we had another PhD student get a commercial plane ticket for Washington on a flight that left at 1 p.m., on the day it was due, of course. He went to the airport at a reasonable time and waited for us just on the other side of security. At 12:30, Andy and I left for the airport. Andy was driving. We made it there in just under 10 minutes. I ran in with the proposal, put it on the conveyor belt for the X-ray. Scott Smolka picked it up on the other side, ran to the flight, and got in just before they shut the door. The proposal got there in time, and we were funded. Who knows where we'd all be now if Andy had been pulled over for speeding, something that has happened many times in the past. After being awarded the cause grant, we sought out industrial partners to work with us on our instructional computer environment. We commissioned this illustration of students in a computerized classroom and put it on the cover of a brochure that we sent to a number of companies. We also gave it to our architect, who designed the Foxborough Auditorium. Credit goes to Bob Sedgwick and PhD student and Brown alum from 1980, Mark Brown, for the idea of algorithm animation and the vision on which this concept was based. Here's the realization of the cause lab, the Foxborough Auditorium, with Andy giving a lecture. We partnered with Apollo, the earliest successful producer of computer workstations. However, their original model, shown here, was a bit larger than what we had in mind. We referred to this as a refrigerator. We had enough money to purchase just 17 of them, so our teaching lab wasn't fully populated right away. So we then, a couple more years, went to have another round of talking to computer companies, and among which was Apple, who was soon to announce the Macintosh. Steve Jobs and a few of his developers, including Andy Hertzfeld, Brown, class of 75, came to visit us in the summer of '83. They brought with them a working Macintosh 6 months before it was officially announced. We thought it was pretty neat, not the least of which was that it fit in a backpack that could be carried on a plane. But it was underpowered for our purposes. There's a short paragraph about this in Walter Isaacson's biography of Jobs, pointing out that Jobs was a bit surprised and concerned about it. In any event, we didn't fill our lab with Macintoshes. We did fill the lab with the second generation Apollo, which was of reasonable size. So how many of you out there remember this machine? Good number. Okay, well, a few years later, we once again solicited proposals from the computer industry for workstations. Jobs had moved on to form Next, whose product is shown here. We went out to visit. He gave us a pretty splashy demo. However, it didn't do well on some benchmarks we provided, and once again, we chose not to do business with Mr. Jobs. We chose to go with Sun Microsystems instead, and they populated our newest lab in the CIT building with their product. Hence, it's called the Sun Lab. Shown here is the last workstation we bought from them, an UltraSpark 10 purchased in the mid-90s. By the late 90s, we came to the conclusion that Sun and its competitors were just too expensive. We switched to commodity hardware and built our own computers that ran Linux, resulting in the Max Built, a machine designed and assembled by our hardware guru, Max Salvis. Max, if you're here, take a bow. There he is. Okay. I'll now say a few words about all our faculty. Okay. Here's the initial 6 faculty that are still members of the department. In the 80s, current faculty that we hired back then were Stan Zidonic, John Hughes, Roberto Tomasia, and Philip Klein. In the 90s, we hired Franco Preparata, Morris Herlihy, David Laidlaw, and Ellie Upfall. In the 2000s, we've hired Amy Greenwald, Sriram Krishnamurthy, Ur Cetintemel, Anna Lysianskaya, Barb Meyer, Chad Jenkins, Soren Israel, Ben Raphael, Rodrigo Fonseca, and Eric Sutterth. And so far in the 2010s, we've hired James Hayes, Pedro Felsenswald, Paul Valiant, Michael Littman, Tim Kraska, Jeff Wong, Stephanie Telix, and we've just hired Vasilis Kamerlis, who will join us in September. No photo as of now. Paris Kanalakis joined the computer science department in 1981 and became a full professor in 1990. He died in an airplane crash on December 20th, 1995, along with his family. He was a rising star in computer science. His loss was a major blow to the department and to the field. I won't go into all of our research endeavors over the past 50 years, but I will say a few words about some relatively recent initiatives. Tom Dean was the first Brown roboticist. He and his students built Gort, shown on the left, in the early 90s. It wandered the halls of CIT for a number of years. More recently, under the direction of Chad Jenkins, the university has started a major robotics initiative with more advanced robots, such as the one on the right. Another research area started in the 90s is computational molecular biology, a program that includes faculty not only from CS, but also from biology and applied mathematics. We started the first undergraduate degree program in this field in 1997 and graduated our first undergraduate students in this area in 2001. This past decade has brought a number of faculty together in the area of cybersecurity. John Savage, who spent a year at the State Department a few years ago as a Jefferson Fellow, became very interested in not only the technical aspects of cybersecurity, but also its policy aspects. Here he is with a group of his students who've just won a cyber challenge competition. Past chair Roberto Tomasia has worked with Brown School of Professional Studies to put together an executive master's program in cybersecurity that's now getting underway. Lastly, this past week saw the inauguration of the Yurt, Brown's newest virtual reality environment. Though the principal investigator of the project is CS professor David Laidlaw, the Yurt is housed at Brown's Center for Computing and Visualization and is intended to be a resource for the entire university. In 1978, we graduated 14 students. On Sunday, we'll be graduating 141 students. It hasn't been steady growth. Most of the valleys in the graph correspond to economic downturns. You can certainly see the effect of the dot-com bust around 2002, 2003, and a little blip for the Great Recession. Okay. Interesting figure is that at the moment, 1 in 9 Brown concentrators is a CS or a joint CS concentrator. Very different from what it was in '78 and earlier. Our undergraduate teaching assistant program is the lifeblood of the department. We couldn't cover the material we do or have students get through the assignments we give without them. Being a UTA requires a lot of work, but is incredibly rewarding. Andy started the program when he arrived at Brown out of necessity. He had no other pool to go to for teaching assistants. Over the decades, it has expanded into our intro courses to all our undergraduate courses. We employed close to 400 UTAs this past year at a cost of almost $500,000. Each course has 1 or more head TAs, and we employ 2 meta TAs to help me run the program. It's one thing that all of us agree on, that the UTA program is essential to the undergraduate experience at Brown and CS. Here's a photo of last semester's TAs for CS22. 50 years ago, at first approximation, you grads didn't do research at Brown. Andy fixed that. Steve Carmody, an undergraduate at the time, he's here today and he now works for Brown, was lead author on the seminal paper on the hypertext editing system. All of us have continued this tradition. We've got many, many papers with undergraduate co-authors. And we've recently formalized our undergraduate research program along the lines of our undergraduate TA program. And here's a scene from last month's highly successful undergraduate research symposium. Here's our current quarters, the CIT building. We moved here in 1988. Initially, we owned just the top 2 floors. Now we own the top 3 with large amounts of space in the bottom 2. We don't own the basement, but we're in the process of moving our servers down to the university's data center. Even so, we're running out of space. The building next door, though ugly, looks inviting. You think I'm kidding. We'll take over a half floor next fall, and 1 or 2 complete floors starting in the spring. The only problem is that the space is inconvenient to get to. So my plan, which is, well, let's see. Here's a rendition of an aerial view of this. This is put together by graduating master's student Nate Bowditch. My plan, which is not yet the university's plan, is to build a building interconnecting the two. Okay, so this gives us the needed space as well as a bridge to the Sili. And with that, I'll turn things over to the first panel. Let me introduce the panel. Chair, Ed Lazowska. Daniel Bergeron, the end. Okay. PhD 73, Ingrid Carlbom, PhD 80. Carol Chomsky, class of 73, Bob Munck, class of 68. The panel's chair, Ed Lazowska, is professor and former chair of CS at the University of Washington and was the prime mover in making it one of the top 10 CS departments in the country. He co-authored one of the first influential operating systems textbooks.
This doesn't come out of my time, right?
It does. And is now the spokesman for CS, being quoted regularly in the press, NPR, and other media. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Tom. It's great to be here. I originally thought the name Stone Age panel was a bit pejorative, but I took a look at some photos of us from back in that period of time, and I decided it was a pretty apt description. So as Tom said, and by the way, I'm sure he's going to be as generous with our timing as we were with his. I arrived in Brown in '68. I graduated in '72 with a write-your-own major in non-numerical computer science, which sounds like lunacy, but back then computers were used for like computing, okay, which is not what we use them for today. I went to graduate school at the University of Toronto because that's what Andy told me to do, and I've been at the University of Washington since that time. And let me reintroduce the panel in order of Brown arrival. Dan Bergeron, as you heard, arrived in '62. That's year 3 BVD, that's before Van Damme, not the underwear. Was an undergrad TA in Andy's first AM 101 in 1965, where Bob Munck next to him was a student. Received his PhD from Brown in '73, spent 3 years at Nijmegen, beginning when Andy was on sabbatical, and has been at the University of New Hampshire on the faculty since '74. Bob Munck arrived as a physics major, was a student in Andy's first AM 101 with Dan as a TA, graduated in applied math in '67, had a joint appointment with applied math in the computer lab from '67 to '73 when he was fired for insubordination by Paul Mader, who was then the provost. Roger Jetty, the director of the computing. How many of you remember Mader and Jetty? We have been forbidden from speaking ill of them today, but I just want to say that they were fine gentlemen, and my career of my relationship with university administrators has been shaped by the time I spent with them. Carol Chomsky arrived at Brown in '69, got an SCB in applied math in '73, stayed on for 3 years working for Andy. That drove her to law school, then 5 years of law practice, and she's been a law faculty member at the University of Minnesota since that time. I should be showing you photos of these people, by the way. That's me, that's Dan, that's Munck, he looks unchanged. That's Carol, and Ingrid didn't like to be photographed back then. She got her PhD 8 years later, spent most of her career in research at Schlumberger and DEC and Bell Labs, and is a professor at Uppsala University in Sweden. So my job is to give you a little context, realizing that people who are less than maybe 55 years old have no idea what computing was like back then. We had planned a set of vignettes that would tell you what life was actually like back then. Then we had an email exchange with Tom Doeppner in which he said that parents, administrators, and the corporation would be here. So we had to clean it up, and I had to wear a suit. So if you find the session to be really boring, you know who to speak with. By the time I arrived at Brown, Andy was already a legend. I took the introductory course from Charlie Strauss, who you heard mentioned before. Toward the end of the course, the graders told me that I was capable enough that I might be allowed to schlepp for Andy. Schlepp means do whatever he wants, like go to Lloyd's and get a sandwich or something like that. So I was told to show up at the computing center at midnight and get led into the machine room. And I did that. At the appointed hour, I showed up. I was led in the machine room. There was this young guy whacking away on a 2250 with a light pen. And I just, he didn't acknowledge my presence, so I just sat there and watched for 5 minutes. And at that point, he turned around and said, "Well, asshole, aren't you going to ask any questions?" So the university's computer, and there was only one, was housed at 180 George Street. The building, like many things at Brown at that time, was a bit of a comedy act. It was designed by a well-known architect, Philip Johnson, and it was designed as a two-story structure above ground plus a basement, but for reasons of economics, the second floor was eliminated to reduce costs, okay? So there were two consequences. One is Philip Johnson dissociated himself from the building, and the other is the roof always leaked because it was designed to keep out coffee spills. So it literally was the case that after a big snowstorm or a heavy rain, people would come in from buildings and grounds and they would use 2x4s and plastic tarping to build tents over the computers to keep the drips from getting on them. You've seen that there's this lovely Gorky tapestry still hanging out there, and that was from Gorky's Paisley period. You've seen that photo before. The computer was an IBM 360 Model 50. It was the newest thing back then for the whole university. It executed 150,000 instructions per second. It had 512 kilobytes of core memory. It had 230 megabytes of secondary storage. 230 megabytes in something the size of 6 refrigerators. By the way, that storage, like the display that you saw earlier, cost $250,000, which would be $2 million today. To buy that amount of storage from Dell would cost 2 cents. That's a factor of 100 million, okay? You programmed the system with punched cards. We even had our own Indeo Speramus punched cards. Your output was in this green striped paper. To put this in perspective, an iPhone has 300 times the secondary storage, 2,000 times the primary memory, and 500,000 times the processor speed of what ran the whole university. We could actually get a lot done, though, because we programmed in assembly language instead of this managed code nonsense that kids use today. So from 8 p.m. to midnight, we used this as a PC. You've heard about the hypertext editing system, right? So Hess was a what you see is what you get hypertext editor running on this vector graphics display. If you go to IBM 2250 on Wikipedia, you see a picture of Chris Brown, who's here in the audience, using a 2250 running Hess. So what Andy had us doing was essentially inventing the future of computing, the World Wide Web melded with Microsoft Word, decades before the hardware was ready. Right? So really making profligate use of hardware to invent the future. It cost money to make profligate use of hardware. Computing was a scarce resource. Everything was accounted. We didn't have that kind of money. Fortunately, we had a third shift computer operator who was in charge of supervising us in the machine room. Her name was Big Grace for reasons that you can imagine, but I'm not allowed to describe today. That's the money. Big Grace had a daughter who aspired to be the leading Girl Scout cookie sales girl in the whole state of Rhode Island. Okay? And so the way this worked was, in return for buying what were really pretty modest quantities of Girl Scout cookies, we were allowed at the end of the shift every day, that is at 7 in the morning, to crash the machine and blow off the accounting records, all right? So nobody got charged for the night's work. It was quite remarkable. The accounting records were stored in core, and at the end of every shift, you would shut the machine down in supposedly a graceful way, and it would punch cards with the accounting data in them, and those would get put in a card box and saved for the end of the week or the end of the month when the accounting records were run. But Grace let us blow these things off every night, which kept us in business. Eventually, Paul Mader, the aforementioned provost, figured this out. Sorry, there we go. And Mader threatened to shut down Andy's research operation. Andy wrote a tearjerker of a letter to Mader that explained how vital it was to keep this going. Rick Harrington and I spent the entire night putting this letter into the Hess editing system. The way we debugged it, of course, was to use it. And so you weren't just typing correspondence, you were bit-tweezing the data structures back together, sort of how we exposed and fixed bugs, dog fooding today. At 5 a.m., successful but punch-drunk, we printed a version of the letter in which we had switched every positive to a negative, every negative to a positive, and we left it on Andy's desk in the castle to sign. and went off and caught a few hours of sleep, and then came back there about 10 in the morning, prepared to go to class, but expecting Andy to say, okay, very funny, where's the real letter? And instead there was total silence. And we sat there and scratched our heads, and finally we said, well, what about the letter? And he said, oh, it was great, I just signed it and sent it off. I didn't bother to read it. Okay, so Harrington and I zipped out of there, and we cut our classes for the entire day. I spent the whole day in the Fons House post office going through bags of mail trying to find this letter. And Harrington spent the whole day in the basement of University Hall going through bags of mail looking for the letter. And at 5 p.m. these places shut down and we couldn't find the damn letter anywhere. And so we dragged ourselves back to Andy's office figuring that his career and ours was over. And he smiled and pulled the letter out from under his blotter. There are other nights I remember. I remember the night that Wolfgang Milbrandt's dog relieved itself in the machine room floor, but Wolfgang will have to tell you that story. It was quite remarkable. Anyway, Hess and his successor, Fress, weren't the only things going on in the Stone Age. And it was mentioned by Tom that Andy was sort of doing all of computer science. So there were a group of people inventing what was called a high-level programming language, the Language for Systems Development, or LSD, at the time. Dan was the leader of that project. We redesigned the scheduling and paging systems of CP67, a virtual memory programming system. Bob Abraham and I did that work, supervised by Bob Munck and Rich Kogut. The Stone Agers built Bugs, the Brown graphics system. Ingrid was part of the graphics group. It was an amazing time because computer science was really new. So the Stone Age ends with the creation of a freestanding Department of Computer Science in 1979. Prior to that, as you've heard, we belonged to the Division of Applied Math. They were an outstanding but somewhat traditional group of academics. That's the Applied Math Department back then with a few computer scientists sprinkled in. This, on the other, they were housed in the Castle, 182 George Street. Andy was up on the 3rd floor. We were all in the basement. There was lots of running back and forth. And the Applied Math folks were pretty tolerant of that. The Applied Math faculty and staff, as I say, we had a somewhat different style. That was us during one of Andy's many failed companies. This was the Providence Research Center of National CSS. By the way, there are 4 subsequent major computer science department chairs in that photo, plus Andy. Actually, it was worse than that. If you really look, all these photos are online. It's pretty scary. Anyway, it was just an utterly amazing time. That's the context. I'm going to turn it over to Dan. There is really a long distance between then and now in terms of the equipment we compute on, in terms of Andy. He's really... This is really very nice. It's amazing what you can find on the web, and it's amazing what he can still get away with. I don't know how this happens. Anyway, for the Stone Agers, it's been a real privilege to have Andy as a friend and mentor really since the beginning. So Andy, to you. And Dan, to you.
It's hard to follow that. So I arrived before Andy, 3 years before Andy, and I took some sort of computer course, a Fortran programming course, and a friend of mine said that, hey, we got this new faculty member coming and he's looking for people to help in his course. Well, I took a course in Fortran, so I went to see this person who was not a legend. He was not yet a legend, wasn't close to it. He was a kid, barely older than I, but you know, he was desperate, and he said, sure, you know more than anybody else who's walked in the door as much, so come on. And it changed my life. It really did. I saw a young man who was absolutely devoted to teaching. He made teaching interesting. He did not have the flamboyant style he just developed. No drag queen, no Darth Vader. A lot of things were different. But his love of teaching and his commitment to it were very clear to me, and ultimately inspired me to one of my loves in my life, which is teaching. And then he went beyond that, and he involved, I was an undergraduate first and then a very fresh graduate student. By the way, the next year I took Applied Math 101 as a graduate student, because I hadn't taken it as an undergraduate, so I could still take it and get credit for it. So I TA'd 1 year, and then the next year I took it, which is pretty cool. But the way he managed to entice us naive people who didn't know anything about computers, and that was my second, well, no, my first love of my wife. Love of my life is my wife. My second is Andy. My third is computers. Teaching's in there somewhere. Anyway, how did he attract us? How did he get us to work all hours of the day, all hours of the night, as schleps, as TAs, on research projects? And I finally realized, thinking about what I'd say here, because he treated us as colleagues. We were kids, we knew nothing, but he treated us as colleagues. And right from the beginning, that makes all the difference in the world. He got so much out of us. I don't know if he did this deviously, but he succeeded. And I certainly think that's a way in which he's made the undergraduate TA program here so successful, and he has inspired so many of us to think of teaching as something for us, as well as our love for computer science. So thank you, Andy. I appreciate what you've done for all of us.
Can I just talk? Okay. I'm Bob Munck. I was class of '67 here. In the fall of 1965, I was a physics major, a very bad physics major. I was possibly one of Leon Cooper's major mistakes. And they were coming to realize this in the physics department as well as I was. But to give you a little more context of the time, this might not occur to a lot of people, a male college student in the mid-60s was in a very tight bind. We couldn't take a semester off. We couldn't take a year off. We couldn't drop out. We couldn't get thrown out, which is what I was heading for, because we'd end up in a rice paddy with a rifle. Fortunately, for me, I thought, there was a strong rumor going around Brown that this course AM 101, which was taught in previous years by some previous member of the applied math department, was a gut. It was said to be a really easy course where you wrote 3 little programs in Lisp. You could take naps. It was just a really easy course. So I signed up for it because I needed that desperately. And a lot of electrical engineers signed up for it because they were having a tough semester in the EE curriculum. And we go in there the first day, it was in the computer lab, and there's this over-caffeinated person up in front. You've all known Andy in his mature old age, and I'm putting quotes around both mature and old age. The old age is kind of explainable. You may have noticed that Angie has a new class every year, and at the end of it, they come out looking about 1.5 years older. And he looks a little bit younger. That's how he's doing it. But anyway, he stood up there and he started teaching us all of computer science in 2 semesters, as people have mentioned that he did. And the engineers were just wiped out. My roommate was one of the EEs who was taking the course. He dropped it. I don't know if any other people managed to drop it or not. It was a lot harder to drop courses in those days. But my roommate ended up spending his whole career building computer systems for General Electric. So that was a big mistake, dropping that course. Anyway, I loved it, and it was obviously something I could do, whereas I couldn't do physics. I gradually worked my way into the inner circle. We had a very large assignment at the end of the semester called Hypotac, Hypothetical 3-Address Computer. I wrote a parody of, well, I guess a parody of Jabberwocky called Hypertacky, with all kinds of horrible puns and so on, and Andy actually liked it. So I got to become somewhat of a grader in addition to being a student. And the first thing I discovered was that after every class, Andy took all the graders, all the TAs, back to his office, and they sat down and told him what he'd done wrong. in that class, in that lecture. What hadn't worked? What was bad? And that just blew me away. I mean, to hear these, you know, drippy little undergraduates telling a professor what he's done wrong. I really took that to heart, and I've tried to do that kind of thing any time that I've taught or done anything like it, because it's just wonderful. Andy was an excellent teacher to start, and this just took him over the stratosphere. So I stayed on. I switched to applied math, just in the nick of time behind the draft, and stayed for another 6 years. Okay, now I'm going to zip to the future a little bit. In the late 70s, a couple of old-timers from the Stone Age here were at Naval Research Lab, and they got us, my little company, a company called Softtech, they hired us to come in and do some fairly large contracts for them. And we did some very successful stuff. But after a while, they gave us a big contract where we needed to hire a bunch of new people. And there was a particular official there who really liked Brown graduates. So he told me, go to Brown, interview a whole bunch of people who are graduating and make them offers. And I did, and I got about a half dozen new graduates from that year. And it was the most exciting thing I've ever done, because I was working with people who had the same background I did, who spoke the same language, who knew all the same concepts. And that kind of thing has occurred to me all through my career. I've worked at about 8 different companies over the years, and I'll just now and again run into a Brown graduate who has been through all this and is just a great computer scientist. Andy has basically salted the entire field of computer science with his people. And it's been an amazing experience. Okay.
So I'm Carol Chomsky, SCB class of 1973. As Ed mentioned, I went off into different directions, and I may be the one person on all these panels who left computer science behind. I don't remember precisely my path into Andy's orbit. I know it had something to do with my first pure math class, which is, I came in as a pure math major, when I discovered that imaginary numbers were kind of unimaginable for me, and I could not figure out what to do with those. So I kind of wandered towards applied math and then ended up in the pre-computer science applied math portion. I do know that I found a home there that was both nurturing and challenging. And I remember a few things. There have been stories that have been zipping back and forth through cyberspace among the panelists, and you've heard some of them here, some of them you haven't heard, may later. And I don't remember quite as many of those unusual stories, but I do remember a few things indicative of Andy, indicative of the group he created around him, and of the Stone Age times. I worked on Fress. You've heard a little bit about Fress. It's a word processor and a hypertext system and a keyword retrieval package and a teaching tool. And this was back, remember, in the late 60s, early 70s. I inherited the program. I did not write it, but I worked on it for about 4 years. And here's the Stone Age aspect, something Ed already referenced. This huge, complicated program doing an enormous number of different things was written in assembly language. So what I remember is those itty-bitty steps by itty-bitty steps. Everything took long lines of code and lines and lines and lines and lines of code to accomplish anything. And I also remember, so this is something I've lived with, these small things that stick in your brain. I don't remember any of the commands except one. Compare logical character, because I had the distinction of having my initials be one of the commands, which was noted. And I've since then used all 3 initials when I initial things, because I want to maintain that. I remember space limitations. So in documents, having to find and delete extra spaces that people would put in their documents because there just wasn't room for them. And actually, I'm still living with this, I delete extra spaces. There's no problem with space now, but I can't get around getting rid of those spaces. I remember carting around huge printouts and poring over them to track down those bugs that seem to run away when you get close to them. I remember the challenge of using Fress just as a word processor for a philosophy dissertation. It was probably our biggest document that we dealt with, several hundred pages, which was very big back then, and the number of times that the system crashed and the number of late night visits to try to debug it to get the dissertation out in a reasonable amount of time. I remember searching, so when we took this program and we wanted to use it for a teaching tool, I remember searching to purchase a single, what we called intelligent terminal, to display multiple windows so that we could have multiple text windows up at the same time, which was, of course, a new thing and one that we were creating. This terminal had to be, because of transmission speeds, remember modems? So I was trying to remember the baud level, 1200, 24, 3600, 9600 may have been like really fast. And we had to have this terminal very close to that building where the IBM 360 was, because if it was too far away, the transmission time would make it impossible to use. And this terminal was one that had to be used by every person. So there were two classes, 2 successive years, classes taught using this terminal. Everybody in the class had to come to that building to use that terminal to do their homework because there were no multiple terminals. So I didn't stay in computer science. So in some ways, I shouldn't be able to say that Andy trained me for what I do now. I'm a law professor, have been a law professor for 30 years. But in many ways, small and large, he trained me to do what I do and certainly be who I am. And so I wanted to share a few of those things with you. Small things. I learned to use chopsticks. I think Andy taught me sitting in a restaurant with the group and nobody laughing. Well, maybe they laughed, I don't know. I learned to appreciate and cook Indonesian food, which I still do, and I attribute it to Andy. I learned that when someone says the computer can't do that, that's not a valid answer. I still can't get them to do what I want, but it's the humans who won't make the computer do that, and I know that, whereas many of my colleagues do not because they haven't been inside the machines. So some bigger things. I learned the value of methodical problem solving. It was probably all those assembly language codes and flowcharts, which played a big part in figuring out the programs, played a big part in how I figure out legal analysis, and I teach it to other students now. Flowcharts help everywhere. The visionary nature of the goals that Andy set for us and what we accomplished. It took, I think, at least, I'd say 25 years before computer-assisted instruction came anywhere near what we did in 1973 to 1976, and most of it still isn't there. Mead Data Central came to talk to us about keyword retrieval. Mead Data Central later developed LexisNexis, which is now one of the big law retrieval systems. I only appreciated that when I ran into LexisNexis years later. A couple of other notable things. A tolerance, you can tell from what people have said, a tolerance of irreverence and quirkiness, because those go along with creativity. He knew that and he fostered it. The inclusion of women in the group, lots of women, certainly statistically at the time and given recent news stories, a good model that has not necessarily been followed everywhere else. My guess is that we weren't always treated as equals. Those are probably some of the stories I don't remember. And I do wonder now about who decided a great gift for the group in Nijmegen would be hats knitted by the women in the group. And I knit at meetings now, so I still remember that. It's sort of connected there too. But we were there, women, in force and given great responsibility. And that leads to the last thing, which is, and Dan mentioned this too as he closed, the extraordinary trust that Andy placed in 20-somethings. Not just to implement projects, not to follow orders, not to take a path that he set, but to envision and lead the projects, to develop things in their own directions, and to really do new things with him as leader, but not top-down leader, definitely bottom-up group. So I thank you for all of that.
So I'm Ingrid Carlbom. Ed spoke about the first time he met Andy, so I feel compelled to do the same. After my first year at Brown, I found myself advisorless, and someone suggested I go and visit the patron saint of lost causes, Andy Van Dam. I headed over to the applied math building and with some trepidation climbed the stairs to the top floor. I knocked on the door politely, and there was no answer. I opened it a bit, there were people in there, but nobody paid attention. Now remember, I was raised in Sweden, and I'd gone to a Swedish undergraduate school, and there you had to pay deference to your professors, address them in third person, and stand up when they entered the classroom. So I carefully approached the man in the center, and in the most polite Swedish way said, "Excuse me, but are you Professor Van Dam?" After a long pause, the man responded, "What's this professor shit?" And from that moment, I knew this was going to be a very different working relationship. And different it was indeed, and it expected the same thing from everyone else that he expected from himself, hard work and results. That included many late nights, but also some occasional early phone calls at home. Sunday morning, "Where are you?" "I'm at home sleeping." "Why aren't you in the office?" "Because I'm at home sleeping." Now, if I did that to my students in Uppsala, they would go and complain to the union, because yes, they are unionized to protect themselves from professors that want them to come to the work Sunday morning. But what was really different in Andy's group, and here I actually do disagree with Carol, was that everyone was equal, woman or man, undergraduate or graduate student. Your past records, good or bad, didn't matter. All that mattered was if you could deliver. Andy created a true equal opportunity environment. And in the early 1970s, I can say, as a woman PhD student, that was a truly unique environment. So Andy had been overseas on a sabbatical and came back rejuvenated and wanted to redo his graphics course. And I had never taken a graphics course, so I was the logical choice for a TA. But I had expressed an interest in graphics, and I learned that the best way to learn material is to teach it. So I did everything from planning lectures and making slides, and most importantly, delivering those throat lozenges that allowed him to give the brilliant lectures. So one day I entered Andy's office, and he said, "Tomorrow we're going to Boston." Okay. "We are going to go to a graphic standards meeting." But he said, "Now remember, you should sit in the back and learn and listen. These people have been thinking about these problems for a long time, so don't say anything." And a couple of these people are here. Dan Bergeron, who just spoke, and Jim Mitchner, I know, is in the audience. So I did, sat in the back, listened, took notes. And a few weeks later, Andy handed me a stack of papers and said, "Here, read this. Tell me what you think." Well, I read it, and I told him what I thought. It was not at all what was agreed upon, what they had written. And as I remember, I also made some disparaging remarks about the English, which was a lot of Schuxberg, Andy would say, coming from a foreigner. But he said, "Call them and tell them." So I did. And to make a long story short, that allowed me to become a key member of the Core Graphic Standards Group and the editor of the status report. So this experience has taught me as a research manager never to underestimate someone's capabilities, but rather to give a person what seems almost insurmountable challenges, and more often than not that someone rises to the occasion. Last thing I want to mention, and maybe the most important lesson I learned from Andy, was not to take a no, it can't be done for an answer. I remember this lesson on more than one occasion when tackling research problems that experts told me couldn't be solved. And I think that Andy's tenacity, his refusal to accept, no, it cannot be done, it was as taking Andy from the basement in the Applied Math building to the Thomas J. Watson Senior Center for Information Technology. And I think this is what is bringing us here to celebrate Andy's 50 years at Brown. Thank you for being a mentor and a lifelong friend.
In deference to our president's schedule, we will introduce our Brown's president, Christina Paxson, to make a few remarks as well.
So thanks, I'm very glad to be here, and it's just wonderfully gratifying to be able to help everybody in this room celebrate the career of teaching and research and friendship that Andy has brought to Brown into the world. So it's just great to see you here, Andy. Thank you very much. Now, you know, I'm going to go off script. I have notes here, I could read the whole thing, but I want to start with a story. And it was sort of sparked by this mention of Andy's irreverence. So we'll see if he remembers this. Andy was one of the first professors I met when I came to Brown. I think it was 3 years ago, and we were marching in commencement. I hadn't started yet, and we sort of fell in line next to each other. And he introduced himself, and I discovered that he'd gone to Swarthmore, and I had gone to Swarthmore, so that was sort of a connection. And then he mentioned that he'd gotten his PhD at University of Pennsylvania, which would have been at the Moore School of Engineering at the time. He knows what I'm going to say now, right? Yeah. So it turns out that my great-uncle, Grist Brainerd, was the chair of the Moore School of Engineering for a while. And I thought, oh, here's another nice connection. I said, Andy, you must have known my great-uncle Grist. Now, Grist was this rather forbidding man who brooked no dissent and did not like irreverence at all. And the look on Andy's face, I realized this was not a man who would ever hide his feelings. And it was, I looked at him and I said, you didn't like him, did you? And he said, not one bit. So I thought, okay, here's a faculty member who, when I talk to him, I know he's going to tell me exactly what he thinks. And I have to say, as president of the university, that's actually a very valuable thing. So I do thank Andy for his graciousness, but also for his directness. And that served me well many times. So I do want to say a few things, though, more seriously about the contributions that Andy Van Dam has made to this university. You know, he brought a new subject, a brand new subject of computing and computers and computing to Brown students. And that required something really special. I mean, all teaching takes creativity and talent. And that's true even for subjects that have existed for centuries. But it takes something special to teach well something that really hasn't been taught before. And that's what Andy did and does, and he does it brilliantly. So, you know, 50 years later, it's hard to imagine anything more important than bringing this subject to the world, to students, to young students. Computers shape every aspect of our lives. I wasn't here earlier for comments, but I'm sure someone must have mentioned Andy's Wikipedia page that goes into great detail about the possibility that the character Andy in Toy Story was named for him. He denies that possibility. It's a staple of guided tours at Brown, and it's an underground legend that I'm sure will be impossible to eradicate, even if it isn't true, but I think it is. But let's concentrate on what's not in dispute. Andy came here as a young teacher. As I said, he received an undergraduate degree in engineering from Swarthmore, an MA and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. My understanding is he is the second person ever to receive a PhD in computer science. And at Brown, he was initially appointed in the applied math department because the computer science department didn't exist. And Andy created a computer science program, which eventually grew into the computer science department, and Andy was its first chair. And as all of you know, over the years, hundreds of students have flocked to Andy's courses as the impact of computers became bigger and bigger. And we've realized, what an outstanding part of Brown, the computer science department, has been and will be into the future. And all of that's due to Andy. Now, I believe that the best teachers are those who are passionately and deeply engaged in the research on the subjects that they teach. And I think it's undeniable, and many of you know this firsthand, that Andy has been and still is a leader in his field, creating the first hypertext system of the 1960s, important and extensive research on computer graphics and hypermedia systems and pen-centric computing and educational software. He's been working for 4 decades on systems for creating and reading electronic books with interactive illustrations for use in teaching and research. So, even in his research, he was devoted to the idea that computers should be teachable, a principle that he's never stopped living as well as teaching. So that's kept Brown on the cutting edge of computing. In 1979, the same year that the Department of Computer Science was created, the department connected with Bell Labs via a very new technology that would become email. In all of these ways, Andy was an innovator, as when he began importing smaller personal computers into the Brown campus, and for use of students well in advance of other universities. And appropriately, Andy was Brown's first vice president for research from 2002 to 2006. So everyone here today knows that Andy has been a devoted mentor to students throughout his 50 years of teaching, and I expect him to continue going on that track. The fact that so many alumni returned to Brown for this celebration is proof that he has inspired generations of students, and we thank him for that. Now, Andy's always been looking into the future, and he continues to do so. The future of computer science at Brown is very near and dear to his heart, and I would say computer science continues to be very strong. 1 in 9 students here are computer science concentrators. The growth in this area in recent years has been simply astounding. The department is moving into new directions. It's moving into data sciences and cybersecurity and virtual reality and robotics. And I think it's important, as we recognize the last 50 years of Andy's teaching and his growing the computer science program here at Brown, that we recognize the need to continue to invest and build in this very important area. We've set an ambitious goal to do something that I think is very important, which is to permanently endow the undergraduate teaching assistant program that Andy started and has grown so wonderfully, and that I think was very important to everybody in this room. And, yes. And in addition to endowing the undergraduate TA program, we've made commitments to endowing new faculty, postdocs, lecturers, and graduate students in computer science. I can't think of a better way to honor Andy than to ensure that his department that he loves so dearly continues to thrive into the future. And I hope all of you will help with this. So let me close with one thought. There's a principle known as Moore's Law, which I imagine Andy knows well. It postulates that over the history of computing hardware, the number of transistors in a dense integrated circuit has doubled approximately every 2 years. So today I'd like to propose an unscientific version on that thought, and I want to call it Van Damme's law. And this postulates simply that the impact of a teacher with Andy's genius doubles every 2 years until it approaches infinity and simply can't be calculated. And then we can say yes to infinity and beyond. Thank you, Andy. Thanks.
Okay, we are now bringing on the Iron Age panel. Norm Meyrowitz, class of 81, is the chair. Mary Fernandez, class of 88. David Niguidula, class of 85. Will Poole, class of 83. And David Salesin, class of 83. Panel chair Norm Meyrowitz gave his all to the department as a U grad, helping out in all possible respects. We've named an award for him, given out occasionally to U grads who provided exceptionally meritorious service to the department. He helped Andy spin out his hypermedia work to IRIS, a campus institute that flourished in the 80s. He went on to be one of the founders of Macromedia, which is later absorbed by Adobe. Norm.
Wait, how did, you guys, that's not on my slides, but if that's Andy, that's good. There we go. So, welcome to the Iron Age. It's 1977. I'm an incoming freshman. And, oh. That's different. Andy is 38. I'm 17. And Aisha, who's graduating this year, was negative 16. Unlike Ed's year, the campus mainframe had 1 megabyte of memory. We doubled. We saw punch cards. This is Paul Strauss feeding in his deck for a freshman project. This is what graphics terminals look like. And for those of you who complain about how long it takes your laptop to start up, you had to start up the IMLAC display with a paper tape. Carol, it was 110 baud. Well, if all we had learned was 1977 technology, we'd be toast, because these things went away pretty soon after. But the faculty taught us the fundamentals of computing independent of the technology du jour, which was fortunate because technology would change radically over my 4 years, much less the 34 years that went on after that. Now, I try to figure out what to call what Andy brought to us. The fundamentals were one thing, but Andy brought another mode of teaching, and I finally figured out what it was. It's called improv. Improv is about thinking on your feet and collaborating. Its main premise is yes and. Your partner throws you a line, you accept it, and you say, and you build on that line to make it into something even better. That's what Andy would do to us. He'd say, Norm, can you go and do this? And you wouldn't know how to do it, but you'd say yes, you'd figure it out, or you'd find some people to figure it out, and you'd add some bells and whistles as well. So it was all about pushing boundaries, it was all about working together, and it was all about making things happen. Sometimes Andy got confused about how yes and worked. As in, Norm, Marv Denikoff from the Office of Naval Research is coming tomorrow with 17 admirals. Can you recompile the window manager so that it plays Anchors Away when they walk in the door? And can you run down to D'Angelo's and get me a crab sandwich, but make sure it was harvested at 6 o'clock this morning, and make sure it was brought to the shop in the same type of ice chest they use for liver transplants. So, and there are a couple lessons here. One is only accept perfection. The second lesson is don't mess with Andy's seafood. So we're an improv troupe, just like Saturday Night Live, or like what I like to call it is Every Night Live. They have a producer, Lorne Michaels, who's the affectionate model for Dr. Evil. We have Andy. And producer isn't the right name. Ringmaster is more the correct name. They have auditions. We have auditions. This is the actual notice from freshman week, my year, inviting us to a seminar that Andy was giving about computing. I dutifully went. Nobody else showed up. We had an hour-long nice talk about newspaper layout and design. And I have a recovered memory of Andy putting his fingers together and saying, "One day he will be mine to do hypertext." Excellent. CS51 was our first audition. This is my listing for the Sci elevator simulation. CS101 was where we learned collaboration. This is our information retrieval program where we work together. That's my listing too. After you pass those courses, you could be a featured player. This is my letter of Andy inviting me into the circus as an undergraduate teaching assistant. If you did that well, you could be a cast member, or as we called it, a schlepp. You could be two types of schlepp. You could be a head TA, as Joan and Beth and I were for Andy and for Bob Sedgwick, and many of these people I was the TA for. Or you could be an undergraduate research associate where you either did graphics. This is Randy Pausch doing a layout system, which was the 1979 equivalent of Adobe Illustrator. He worked with undergraduates, Joe Pato, with Dave Salesin, with Steve Feiner, who was a PhD candidate, with faculty. As was said before, everyone was treated as colleagues. If you can get stuff done, you're equal in everybody's eyes, and that was a great thing. If you weren't doing graphics, you got to do everything else, like text processing and window managers and object-oriented programming. And we did it, and we had a couple of papers published as undergraduates because no one told us that that didn't happen. The SNL has hosts that bring special talents. Our special talents were faculty that, again, not only instructed us, but collaborated with us as undergraduate research assistants and as undergraduate teaching assistants. They looked like that, and they looked like that, and money was tight, so they moonlighted as catalog models. We had the crew, the staff that kept the computers running, and the administration and the finance. And we had the same type of after parties. Ours were at Little Chopsticks. And Andy thought of them more as eating lessons than after parties. And we learned about scallops with XO sauce, and shrimp with clams with black bean sauce, and whole crispy fish, and make sure the guest of honor gets the cheek. Make sure the guest of honor gets the cheek. Well, when SNL folks leave the nest, they write books, they do TV, they make movies. Our folks go to academia. Our folks go to industry. I went to Macromedia. At one point, I had 8 different generations of Andy head TAs working for me. And some of them actually do go and make movies. Scott Anderson was the visual effects supervisor who animated Babe in the movie. And Kurt Fleischer wrote the tools that were used to animate Finding Nemo. Saturday Night Live had cultural impact on things like more cowbell. We had cultural impact in things like the 386 that John Crawford was the architect for, Windows 95 that Brad was the architect for, the Macintosh, which Andy Hertzfeld was one of the chief architects for, and I had the privilege to manage the Flash team. Now, the thing about all of these is that all of these shipped hundreds of millions or billions of copies, and that's no coincidence. The management we learned being undergraduate TAs, the innovation we learned how to do as undergraduate research assistants, and the collaboration and the innovation that we learned, and the improvisation, that's the most important part. That made it seem like world domination was straightforward and actually required. So, gathered here, we're an improv troupe. We go to birthday parties, we go to picnics, we go to reunions, we go to Japan and give talks, and Ducky takes us on a train so we can eat sea urchin and eel and octopus. So we're not even an improv troupe. We're an extended family. And that's all because 50 years ago, Andy instilled in Brown's CS department his core belief that he told me, that teaching is the noblest profession. Thank you, Andy.
I'm going to move the water because I have my notes on an iPad. Wouldn't be good. I came to Brown in, oh, are you going to introduce me or anything?
No.
No, okay. Hold on a second, let's see, I think.
Oh yeah, live from Providence.
Let's get to my slides at least. Ah, there we go. All right, this is me. I came to Brown in 1979 and was involved in the graphics lab before the end of my freshman year. My first research assistantship was with Tom Banchoff in the math department, who's here today as well. I worked with him creating images and animations of four-dimensional surfaces. Here's one of the images from that collaboration. As an undergraduate RA in the graphics lab, I of course interacted with many of Andy's students as well. On those 40 animations, I collaborated with Steve Feiner, one of Andy's PhD students at the time. Steve suggested we all co-author a paper on our system, and because Andy had created the culture of undergrads doing research and collaboration, my first research made the back cover of the SIGGRAPH 82 announcement, which I was able to find on my shelf, and also the front cover of IEEE Computer Graphics and Applications, where that first paper of mine was published. Well, it didn't take too long for Andy to discover me as well, and soon I had 2 mentors and 2 taskmasters. With Andy, I worked on the document layout system, part of a much larger system with many components, each run by a different undergraduate researcher, to envision and prototype the future of electronic documents. If there's one thing Andy taught us, it was how to give good demos. We regularly had sponsors and potential sponsors coming through, and we always had to be ready to demo our latest work. He taught us how to always save a backup in case the version that we were compiling when the visitors walked in the door wasn't going to run. Meeting with Andy in those days was never an easy thing. He always had a line of students waiting outside his door. When you were finally admitted for entrance into his office, he was on 2 phones at the same time. He was also doing email, answering the email, and literally, while he was doing this, he was talking to you, telling you what you should be doing too. I even have memories of getting him a sandwich at Lloyd's Deli, like Ed and so many other people, and bringing it to him during his haircut, so that Andy, ever the multitasker, could eat his lunch, get his haircut, and talk to me all at the same time. Andy may have been a difficult taskmaster, but he allowed us, expected us even, to take full responsibility for our work. So we really felt like we were doing this for ourselves and not for him. And that's been a crucial lesson for me as a manager ever since. This also gave me the confidence to take on other collaborations, such as working with a graphic designer to create covers for an algebra text, or actually three textbooks, and also that was with Tom Banchoff, and working with Ken Miller, who was then a young professor in biology, to visualize cell membranes, work that got us on the cover of Nature. In the graphics lab environment that Andy created, it never occurred to me that so many collaborations and publications were anything unusual for an undergraduate. Andy was also fearless. Go after what you want was his credo. That was hard for me, mainly because there were so many things that I was excited about and wanted to go after. Finally, in the fall of my senior year, as I contemplated my future, Andy told me, look, I'll help you get into any place you want, but I'm not going to help you get into 10 places and have you turn down 9 of them. So you have to decide what you want. I decided that if I could go anywhere, what I really wanted would be to join the graphics group at Lucasfilm, where rock stars like Ed Catmull and Alvy Ray Smith were inventing the future of computer graphics. So Andy made a call and got me an interview. And before long, I was working there, and soon after, hiring all the rest of the Brown Mafia behind me. Ronen Barzel and Bob Drebin were my first 2 hires, and here we are, an old picture in our office there at Lucasfilm. You can see Bob, who's here today as well. Later, they were followed by H.B. Siegel, Kate Smith, Michael Shantzis, Michael Rubin, and quite a few others. Soon, Ronen, Bob, H.B., and I were giving demos of our Pixar image computer at SIGGRAPH 84. By this time, we were all old hands at demos, thanks to our training with Andy. And right after, I headed to Europe, sleeping on trains and eating in cheap restaurants to save money. Eventually, I met up with Andy in Geneva, and Andy's first question was, so, have you been eating well in Europe? And I had to admit that the best food I had had was on the plane. So, Andy sprang into action, inviting me to join him at a 3-star Michelin restaurant, but making it clear that I would have to pay my own way, which would cost more than all the meals up until that point on my trip put together. Of course, I was going to get my money's worth. So at the end of our 7-course meal, when the waiter came and introduced the cheese cart with dozens of cheeses, I said, well, how many can I have? And he said, well, as many as you'd like, monsieur. And I said, well, I'll have all of them in that case. And I ate them all. And then when he came out with the dessert cart and the dozens of desserts, and I said, how many can I have? And he said, you could have all of them. I said, I will have them all. And so I ate all of the desserts as well. And Andy gained new respect for me that night. Because eating everything like that is exactly something he would have done. Over the 30 years since, Andy and I have taken a whole series of vacations and treks together, from backpacking through the Grand Canyon to a family trip with Debbie in China. Here's a little dog in China and other pictures. Later, when I finished grad school, Andy convinced me to apply for faculty positions, even though I hadn't been considering academia. Long story short, I ended up having a very successful career at University of Washington, basically by replicating the very conditions that Andy had created for me at Brown, with undergraduate research assistants and undergraduate TAs. Of course, it didn't hurt that several other students of Andy's were also on the faculty, including Ed Lazowska, who was my department chair for much of that time. For Andy, being a professor is a calling, and I'm very fortunate to have been among his progeny, and in turn to have been able to convey many of the principles I learned to my own students, thereby helping to carry on his legacy. How to teach, how to do research, how to give students full responsibility as TAs and RAs, and thereby instill confidence in them, how to get them to figure out what they want in life and go after it fully, and how to eat good food and lots of it.
I'm really glad we have a PC up here now instead of a Mac. You'll find out why in a minute. I'm Will Poole. I was class of 83. My story actually begins back in the Stone Ages in '76, where I was a bored high school student, a high school freshman across town in Providence. My mom suggested that I enroll with Brown's program for high schoolers, and the catch was that that system was designed for seniors, and I was only a freshman. Fortunately, a simple decision would change my life. And that decision is that Professor Strauss, who was teaching introductory computing while Andy was on sabbatical, said that if I could get a B or better in my first couple of assignments, that he'd help me get registered to take Applied Math 51. And that plan worked. So as a full-time student later, I saw many of my friends graduating and going on to work for big companies like Digital and IBM. But this really did not fit my self-image at all. Not surprisingly, when I finally graduated in '83, I had already started a company long before it was cool to do so, to do startups in college. And 12 years later, the third startup I co-founded was a pioneer in e-commerce called eShop. And somewhat to my surprise, 6 years after we were acquired, I was asked to take the helm of Microsoft's $10 billion Windows business, the most profitable business unit of the world's largest technology company. Now, while attending Brown, I certainly never would have predicted that I'd end up leading a group of 3,000 people and shipping about 8 releases of Windows XP, which hopefully you remember as the most recent version that most everybody actually liked. It was while I was running Windows that I became reacquainted with Andy, who was at that time, and still is, a very esteemed advisor to Microsoft Research. Now, coming back to Brown's Iron Age of computing, I'll just re-remind you about what technology we worked with. They were quite primitive. A number of us spent time using the mainframes that you've already seen today. This is the 360-67, ran about half a MIP. As you know, the VAX 11780 runs a MIP, and the computer science department got one of those, doubling the speed, pretty exciting. By comparison, though, the hot device of du jour, 1,500 times faster on the Apple Watch. Now, one thing that Andy liked to do most with all those MIPs was to move graphical bits around. And unlike others, graphics is how I first started to learn from Andy in CS276. Now, little did I or the other students know that Andy was practicing the fine art of just-in-time authorship for the seminal graphics book he was co-authoring. We received printed chapters of the book and were given the privilege of not only learning graphics from Andy, but also providing markup and debugging sample code as we learned. It was through this and other classwork that Andy identified talent and sucked it into his many projects. Now, the cool new thing in 1980 was the Ramtech. It was attached to the VAX and housed in a windowless basement room. It cost on the order of $100,000 and performed a tiny fraction of what a $150 graphics card and monitor does today. Now, with this exciting device in place, I watched Andy do interdisciplinary work, which was an example of his leadership. In this collaboration, he was working with Tom Banshoff to render and film colored rotating 4D hypercubes. They showed movies of these unfolded fourth-dimensional wonders to inspire both math and computer science departments, students alike. Back in the Iron Ages, most of us saw computing as an end in and of itself. And Andy saw that computing was a fundamental science that ultimately must be applied to virtually every field of inquiry. He was right then, and he's even more right now. Now back to the graphics lab. That summer, we spent untold hours working on a project that Andy had sold to some hapless technocrat in the Navy. The concept was simple. The Navy had aircraft carriers with repair manuals that filled rooms. Andy's vision was that within 15 years, handheld iPad-like devices could hold all the technical documentation the Navy would need. And he was right again. I have to relate one short story. Andy was known for delivering messages to graduating seniors in various ways. Shortly before I received my diploma, Andy shook my hand and said, "What the hell are you still doing here?" In tribute to my extended undergraduate experience. With others, he put messages into their diplomas. On the right side, you see the delight of one of our most accomplished classmates, Randy Pausch, who went on to become a member of the CS faculty at Carnegie Mellon and was sadly taken from us by cancer a few years ago. One of the many things I learned from Andy was the power of leading and inspiring others to follow, and to do so by setting a pace and a standard of excellence that draws out the best in everyone. And of course, if you're Andy, you not only inspire others to follow and do great work, you inspire them to do it for 100+ hours per week, barely making minimum wage if you're lucky. In my post-tech career, I hope to make an even bigger impact using the principles of leadership, interdisciplinary work, and strategic long-term thinking. I'll be helping a next generation of entrepreneurs make their mark on the world using the many skills that I was so fortunate to learn from Andy and others at Brown. Thank you, Andy.
So hi, I'm David Niguidula, and I'm here specifically to talk about Andy's work in computing and education. And I think because I probably have one of the longest tenures of being a TA, I was from the fall of '82 until the spring of '97. Speaking of which, did anybody bring the drink? No? Okay, well, hang on. Second generation TA, so. So Andy, as you know, has long taught the introductory course, and I remember in the critical review, our friend Mason Wu put the description this way, among the different courses. The difference between Andy's course and the other intro courses is the difference between going into a wading pool and taking a 10-meter platform dive. So, not being content enough to do that, in the fall of '83, as folks have mentioned, we decided to put a double somersault twist into that. This was the first year of saying, let's do graphics. We have a computer that can do it. And we brought in the Apollo DN300s, the first networked workstation, which lots of folks here worked on, including the first demos, so a classroom with actual animation so that we could explain key concepts. A lot of the folks here, like Karen Smith and Liz Waymeyer and a whole bunch of our other folks and people working for both our class and Bob Sedgwick's class developed these different animations, which are still actually quite useful. If you were to look at them today, they'd still be as useful as anything else. But of course, we decided to do all this at the same time that Brown moved its calendar to pre-Christmas exams. So not only were we doing all of this, we were doing this in a month less than usual. But we were 20 years old, and it was impossible, but we didn't know that. So we went across, do that, and about 250 students managed to get through that course. I'm sure a lot of them are here now. But the impact of that course went beyond Brown. Remember, this is 1983. The Macintosh didn't come out till the next year. But then when it finally did, lots of colleges across the country started to do that. This is actually a Brown Mac lab. And my particular role was working with Andy on a book, because of course, you can't have a text for a course that never existed before. This was originally out of a GISP that Dave Nanian and Karen Seiler and Susie Galvin and Janine Roth and a whole bunch of other folks, Amy Tozer, worked together on. Eventually became this book that other people could benefit from. So across the country, we had colleges and high school kids, the first AP computer science were able to say, hey, computer science doesn't just have to be about numbers, it can actually be about creating cool graphics. The idea of actually having something animation as something you would do in your first few weeks was pretty cool. I should tell a brief story about that. This was the first book put on the Macintosh, and our editors at the time would regularly talk to us about it and say, well, we need this, and we had one of these polite conversations with Andy ranting one day. So I called up the next day and talked to our editor and Trina Avery was, of course, very helpful in keeping all this very calm, but called up and said, what Andy really meant to say was, and they said, look, it's okay. Andy's a diva, but at least he knows how to sing, so. But the course that I worked on after I came back to Brown and was working at the Coalition of Essential Schools was collaborating with Andy on something called the Educational Software Seminar. And in this version of it, which ran from 89 to 97 with me and later with Roger Bloomberg, was the idea of taking this idea of technology in education and bringing it to the local places. So we recruited projects from local schools, Hope High School, Wheeler, and other places, and teams of undergraduates would come up with a piece of software using Authorware or HyperCard and actually deliver it into the classroom. And what this did was a couple of things. It brought local teachers into the idea of saying, here's what you can actually do with technology. So that was interesting. And undergraduates actually had the experience of saying, well, this is what it means to work with a real client. So even if they didn't go into education, the idea of delivering something for somebody real, not just another TA, was something that's very helpful. This is actually one of Andy's slides from a 1998 talk called Education, the Unfinished Revolution. And it describes the infinite loop here of how technology is brought in with great hype when ultimately leads to cynicism and hoping the next thing is going to be the answer. But we know from this experience what really is going to make the difference, what breaks the cycle, which is you have someone like Andy who's a great teacher and all of this comes together. So thanks so much for everything.
That's my husband, Adam Buchsbaum, who's sitting there in the second row, also a CS grad. So Andy, when Tom asked me to speak on the 80s panel, I said yes instantaneously. But I knew that I couldn't do this alone. So I asked my classmates and friends, Grace Kim, Liz Waymeyer, Janine Roth, Karen Smith, Jenny Richland, and Penny Feinberg, some of you ladies are out there, if I could include their memories of life with Andy. Now, we know that you and Debbie are huge Broadway fans. And if we were playwrights, Life with Andy might be a musical in 3 acts starring Brian Stokes Mitchell. And it would be a tearjerker. So I hope you have a hanky, and if not, Dave brought you one. Just in case. Dave, you want to just give that to Andy, just in case. Thanks. When we arrived at Brown in 1981, computer science was an utter mystery to us. For Jenny, taking CS11 appeased her dad, who preferred that she attend Wharton's undergraduate school. Wharton, really. Jenny remembers, I had never seen a computer and had no interest whatsoever in taking computer science, but I agreed to do it if it meant I could go to Brown. I figured I'd take the intro class and get it over with, and then I met Andy. I left my first lecture so excited and fired up, his energy and enthusiasm for computer science were contagious. My memories are actually quite similar, but a bit more dramatic. I remember Andy bouncing in front of the blackboard. Yes, a blackboard. I mean, do you remember, like, he was doing this all of the time? It was insane. He made prophetic, wild-eyed pronouncements like, you are all witnesses to an impending revolution. Someday, everyone is going to have a computer in their home. I remember this. Someday, we will carry them on our bodies, in our pockets, and will rely on them for our every need. But with real computers the size of trucks and PCs were essentially useless, all I could envision was something like this. We didn't know Moore's Law yet, but Andy hooked Jenny and me and all of you with the future it predicted. And by the end of CS11, Jenny and I were both CS concentrators. Andy encouraged his students to embrace CS and humanities equally. Penny Feinberg remembers, Andy made it possible for me to pursue my double concentration in CS and art. I had decided to study in Italy junior year, but was concerned about fulfilling my CS requirements. Andy let me take CS 224, his legendary graduate-level computer graphics class, as a sophomore. He had faith in me that after only 3 semesters I could do it. Before leaving, I mentioned that I would love to work in the department when I returned. Andy told me to contact him from Italy, and he would arrange something. Now, this was 1984. The only international phones were in the post office. So I wrote to Andy on blue email stationery. I know for some of you in the room, you've never seen this before. I just wanted to, okay. Penny did not receive a reply, but she said that when she returned in June, Andy had a job waiting for her. Andy's encouragement for anyone who's ever worked with him could also sometimes be painful. Grace shared that during her senior year, during my senior year, I did an independent study with Andy in computer applications to medicine. This is 1984, groundbreaking territory. Weeks before graduation, Andy said, I want you to write an honors thesis. I had senioritis, my job was set, and yet I could not resist because, well, it was Andy. I wrote that honors thesis on the verge of tears. But my thesis was eventually published and a finalist in a student competition on computer applications to medicine. Most of Andy's greatest lessons were extracurricular. Liz Waymeyer remembers, he gave me Fs and I'm grateful for it. Andy provided me with time to flex my academic muscles. He supported me when I floundered and showed me that failure was something to learn from. He fostered my interests in CS in a way that fit me. Andy was a visionary who brought us with him into an exciting new future. As undergraduates, Karen, Liz, and Janine contributed to that future, as Dave just mentioned, by creating an independent study on educational software, a nascent field in which generations of Brown CS grads have become leaders. Their work led to Liz's honors thesis and ultimately to her influential career in user experience design. For all of us, Andy, our CS Brown education in computer science laid the foundations for challenging, rewarding, and very, very successful careers. From all of us, from Karen, Grace, Penny, Janine, Jenny, Liz, and me too, thank you, Andy, for believing in me more than I believed in myself, for pushing me to achieve things I didn't think I was capable of, for hiring me as a CS11 TA, even though I only earned a B in the class, for teaching me to move quickly and with purpose, for believing in men and women equally, and for creating a worldwide family of Brown CS alum that we are all so proud to be part of. Andy, you believed that if you gave each of us a chance, we would do great things. And everyone here today is proof that you were right. Congratulations.
Further change to our schedule. Our next speaker will be our Provost, Vicki Colvin.
I guess we're getting into the habit of having university administrators between the panels, which is always good. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to just say a few words about computer science and what I've learned about it in my first year at Brown. So, you know, when you come to a new place, you have the advantage of seeing it with fresh eyes for what it is, and sometimes the people in the place don't always see it that way. So one of the things I've learned about computer science, and I'm going to talk about its relationship to Brown, is how much it embodies so many of the core values I've discovered about this place. One of the things I knew about Brown before I got here was it was a school in which its crown jewel was really the undergraduate experience. Ever since the open curriculum, this institution has become known for doing innovative and really remarkable things for undergraduate education. And so one of the tensions that Brown faces is how do you manage the undergraduate education and the commitment to that with now a real ambition to take the world stage as a major international research university. And that's a lot about what the campaign in the next 10 years will be about. And that's a really difficult tension for anybody who's a faculty member here, because really the people who come here like Andy are really dedicated to the undergraduate experience. So how do you balance that? And I think within this department, you see a really amazing way to do that, which is the close contact with the faculty in the UTA program, also reflected in undergraduate research. And really before his time, he kind of realized that really what's the value of a residential education? That's actually a question many of us now have to answer very directly in universities with the advent of, you can get almost any course online for free. So really, why do you come to a university? And it really is that very special interaction between faculty and students. And I would use the word communities that build in a residential place like Brown. And I think CS has done an amazing job of that. And I think the UTA program is a really phenomenal example of integrating research and education and really building those close faculty-student bonds. And that's definitely true from what I've heard already. The other thing that I will say about computer science here that I've learned that is really embodies Brown is that Brown is such a weird place. It really is, in that the students who come to Brown largely are attracted by the fact that they can chart their own intellectual directions. And there seems to be almost a competition for putting the weirdest things together in a concentration or a major. And I really see that in the CS department. Whether it's cybersecurity, which is integrating the work at the Watson Institute with the work in computer science, or my favorite example, just yesterday there was a Yurt inauguration, and I was talking to some of the people using it. Of course, it was developed by computer scientists here, but we had literary artists using it and geologists, and I was just waiting for them to say, and hey, we're collaborating too, to put rocks with words or something. But that sort of spirit of, I call it juxtaposition, putting unusual things together is really very much a value of Brown. And I think because computer science is so pervasive, certainly in our lives today, it really shows up in a lot of different ways in this department. And so what I want to turn to next is really kind of the future of computer science and how I think we're looking at it. So a really important question. All of you have had amazing experiences at Brown. We're sort of marching through time and getting snapshots of it. But the question is, who is going to be the next Andy Van Dam? How are we going to recruit the very best faculty in computer science to come to Brown and to create the kinds of communities and experiences that Andy has been able to do? And that's really an important question to consider, because it's a very fast-changing world. And I think Andy himself, as I'm learning from the examples, has this amazing ability to see the future, right? To say that someday we're going to carry computers around in our pockets, and to say that in a somewhat fearless way. So I think particularly for computer science, you have to be able to really imagine the future. And you may not know this, I actually looked this up. There are not many academic departments that are so young. My field of chemistry, I think, started 300 years ago in natural philosophy. Hasn't changed very much, it's still chemistry. But if you are a computer scientist, your discipline is one of the youngest at the institution, and it's one that has undergone revolution after revolution in its intellectual content. And I think if you look to the future, that means it's probably going to continue to be highly dynamic and to really expand across the campus in really ways that are hard to predict. So what's going on now in computer science is really, what is the future? How do we imagine where we can put Brown as a department and have it be ready ahead of the changes that are unfolding? Some of these areas that again speak to sort of the core values of Brown are areas in robotics, but Brown isn't going to do robotics in the conventional way. Instead, our robotics group is really focused on the human interactions with robots, which are really becoming one of the most important factors in how effective they are. We have virtual reality, which is of course exploding now, and so we want to be ahead of that. that. I was fortunate enough to attend the CS class Internet of Things, and I saw, I was amazed to see all of the different sort of physical devices and sensors integrated and really working with software. In fact, a lot of the CS concentrators I talked to, when I said, so what was the hardest thing about, making the beer keg dispense exactly 2 milliliters of beer from your app on your iPhone? And to a T, they all said working with the hardware, that was so hard. But, that's the future, right, is that integration of the hardware and the software, and I think the department is perceiving that with visionaries like Andy leading. And so all of these areas are ones that will shape and define the intellectual content of the department going forward. And it's really important to have that vision and to then invest in that research, because that is going to be what attracts the spirit of Andy Van Dam in somebody who's maybe 25 and looking for their next academic move. And so Brown has to be able to compete in that arena, I think, to continue to have this amazing community that you guys are a part of continue. So that really is an important picture to keep in your mind. What is the place going to be like in 10, 20, or 30 years? And so there's sort of two things I'll just leave you with. One of the things that I know is near and dear to Andy's heart is the UTA program. And one of the things I can say, when you have one TA for every 10 students, as a provost, I can tell you it's really expensive to do that, but it works really well. So how can we put that on a foundation that will endure forever? So it's not under the vagaries of the university budgets, which go up and down, but it's really a solid part of the department for decades to come. And I know that's going to be a really important goal for us. And I think the second thing that's important is to think through the future of computer science. We have 1 in 9 of our students, as Chris says, will actually become concentrators in this area. We have increasing demand for these classes, and more than that, increasing competition for the very best minds to come to Brown and to teach our undergraduates. So we're going to have to make sure that our department has the facilities, the resources to really attract and recruit those people in what are going to be the frontier areas of this discipline going forward. So that's my plug. There's actually on the website, you can go and you can click donate, so you can actually contribute to making sure that this community you're a part of will really persist for many, many, many years. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you. It's been wonderful to hear the stories, and actually just inspiring, because I think all of us in universities come to universities not so much because of the ability to do research and have ideas that might impact the world, but it really is, as most of life is, always about people. And what I've learned from the stories is how connected you all are as a community. And I just think it's remarkable that Andy and his department have been able to do that. So thank you so much.
Next up, we have the machine age panel. Janete Perez is the chair, class of 06. Yudi Fu, class of 13. Nabeel Bilani, class of 12. Ely Greenfield, class of 96. David Wadhwani, class of 93. Janete Perez was one of the classic head TAs, doing it twice for CS15 alone. She was very actively involved with the department and with diversity issues. She was a real cheerleader for her fellow students. Janete?
Good evening, everyone. Can you play video one? Video one. We'll start with something a little different for you guys. It's some audio. Maybe. Can we restart it and do the audio, please? We'll play it again at the end. So can you switch over to my laptop? So Good evening, everyone. I know we're running a little bit late, so we'll try to be as quick as possible. We are the machine age panel, so we're all robots and barely human, so we should be able to zip right on through. So you just saw Andy, and I think a note about this is that this is the Andy that we know. It's a very playful, fun, willing to do anything to teach us CS, and I think that you'll see a lot of this sprinkled throughout my presentation, so I hope you enjoy it. We'll start off by introducing each other, so we'll start youngest to oldest, or wisest, and I will say that I got chartered with mid-90s to present, so about 20 years of students in history here. So yeah, we'll get started with Yudi.
I introduce myself?
Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name's Yudi. Can you all hear me? Hello? There you go. Better? Oh, there we go. My name's Yudi. I graduated 2013, so just 2 years ago, with a degree in computer science and math. I came to Brown for a applied math degree, and then second day of shopping period, I walked into CS15. I saw Andy walking into the class with a Mickey Mouse hat, and I was hooked at that moment. And note that that was my first week in the United States. I grew up in China and finished high school and I came to the United States, so I went back and asked my roommate, is that what you guys do in class in the United States? Is that normal? Well, of course, that wasn't normal, and that was Andy, and that was amazing. Since then, I TA'd for Andy for CS15, and ever since summer of my freshman year, I worked as a research assistant at the graphics lab. That went on for all the rest of my time at Brown, and my senior year, I led a research project for Andy. And right now, I work as a software engineer in San Francisco in a company called Strava. We build mobile apps and websites to track athletic activities via GPS. So that was my quick intro.
All right, thank you. So my name is Nabeel. I graduated in 2012 in computer science and applied math. And kind of like Yudi, I had no intentions of doing CS. In fact, the day before I left for Brown, my mom asked me what I wanted to major in, and I said anything but computer science. So I was a very lazy senior in high school, and I didn't do a very good job in my AP computer science class, and I thought that that's what computer science would be like forever and always. And again, I came to CS15, and I think one of the first things Andy said was, who's taking a computer science class, raise your hand, and a fair amount of people raised their hand. And he said, good, you're going to unlearn everything you've learned in the past up until now. And so I think that's probably why I stuck around in the course. And so I just remember doing, I think it was the second project in CS15, and I was struggling with it. It was a tough project. Now that I look back, it's probably 10 lines of code, but it was a really tough 10 lines of code. And I just remember going to a TA and just having her walk me through the problem, empathize with me, understand my frustrations, and helping me solve the problem. And I just remember walking up Thayer Street after that, going to Eastside Pockets, feeling like I was on top of the world. And I wanted that feeling to last forever, and so I decided to major in computer science. I think one of the attributes of the department that are most compelling and most obvious is that it's a very human department, and others have said this already. But I think really a lot of that stems from the person that Andy is, and I think in particular his humility. And that's something that I realized, I think, firsthand when I was head TAing with him. And I think that there's one particular story that really sticks out to me, which is I think it was after probably the lecture on polymorphism, which is a core concept in object-oriented programming. We were walking back from Macmillan to his office, probably to edit lecture slides. And we were in the elevator, and Andy asked for my feedback. He said, how did I explain polymorphism? Do you think the students got it? Do you think I did a good job? Did it sort of resonate with them? And to have a professor who's 70 whatever years old ask for, I was probably like 12 or 13 at the time. No, I was 20, 21 at the time. To ask for my feedback on the topic he's probably explained 20 or 30 times. For me, that was a really sort of eye-opening experience, and I think a testament to Andy's character. So, thank you.
You know, I actually remember in the mid-90s when we first explained to Andy what polymorphism was, and so it's great that he's asking for feedback, but you'd think you'd get it by now. Go back to that photo for a second.
Okay, wait. Okay, you're next. Great.
There we go. So I have to admit something. That is not actually a picture of Andy. There's a lot of computer graphics people in the crowd, so I know there's some finely trained eyes that can pick out a Photoshop job. David and I work for Adobe, so don't feel bad if you did not pick that out. The reason actually I had to do that is because I asked my mother, actually, who I was with the past day, if she had any pictures from my graduation of me and Andy. And she admitted to me that she was too intimidated by Andy to take a picture of him. So that was what I had to do. So I started at Brown in '91, and I was probably actually, I would guess, one of the first generations to come to Brown thinking I already knew how to program, right? Because I had actually learned to program in high school, and personal computers were pretty common. So on the first day of classes, I went to my CAP advisor class in American Studies, I think. And then afterwards, I went in to see Professor Van Dam to ask him whether or not I should take that introductory computer science programming class or go right to the next one, because I already knew how to program. And I spent a good 10 minutes in his office explaining to him what I knew, what I didn't know, what I thought the pros and cons were, while he was busy writing email or on the computer the whole time. And at the end of the 10 minutes, I said, so I'd love your advice, which class should I take? And I believe his response was, well, if you think you can handle it, go for it. And so I thought, well, with that kind of wisdom, I need to get more of this. So I changed my advisory class to be CS11, CS15 now, and took it with Andy, and had a fantastic time. I had such a fantastic time that actually the following semester, the following year, about half of my freshman unit decided to also take computer science because they saw how much joy I got out of the class, not just the work, but the class itself, and thought it was something they actually had to do. And about half of them actually stayed with it and are now leaders in the industry. The other half, whenever I read the first couple sentences of the poem Howl, it always makes me think of them. I'm going to read those for you right now, for those of you who don't know it. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked. It kind of goes on like that. But so I loved it so much that, of course, like a lot of people here in the panel in the audience, I went on to TA for Andy the following year. I was an undergraduate TA on CS11 under this guy. I was then a head TA the following year. Both those years, I believe, we rewrote the class. I went on to be an undergraduate TA in the undergraduate computer graphics class, CS123. We rewrote the class that time. The next year, I was a head TA for it. We rewrote the class. I think one phrase that probably no one has ever heard Andy say is, that worked pretty well, let's just do that again. After my semester head TAing, I took a semester off. I worked in the undergraduate graphics lab. I actually worked at a company in Providence that Andy had his fingers in, Electronic Book Technologies. And there's some other people here who work there. I enjoyed that so much that when I graduated, I decided, okay, I need to stay in this world. And Norm, who was the head of the previous panel, recruited me into Macromedia, where I worked for 5 years until I figured I had enough of that world and went to work for another startup founded by some of Andy's disciples with his involvement called Equil, which I worked at for 2 years. And then when it got absorbed by Microsoft, I decided, okay, I'm ready to leave. I've grown up. I can leave Andy's family now. And I went to another startup that Andy had nothing to do with. And I stayed there for 3 days. At which point Norm called me and said, hey, you want to come back to Macromedia? I said, yes, please. So I learned my lesson, and I've been actually there ever since, now part of Adobe, where, as I think Norm mentioned, there is an absolute embarrassment of riches of former TAs and head TAs and disciples of Andy's. And it's been quite a ride. So I think it's fair to say that if it weren't for Andy, I would be living in a refrigerator box somewhere. So.
I'd like to add that we know that Andy was listening to Eli's comments because he was doing email while Eli was talking. It's okay, Andy. We won't take it personally. So I got to Brown in 1989, and as I've been talking to people, I thought this was a unique story, but it's not. I came in as pre-med. And I just decided to take CS11 for fun. I walked in there, I saw Andy talking about all the projects we were going to be able to do by the end of the year. I left there a CS major. It was so clear to me that this was such an amazing opportunity and things were changing, and Andy did such an eloquent job of setting up what the future of the world was going to be and why the group of people that stuck with CS were going to be the ones that write the future. It was incredibly inspiring, and really haven't looked back since. I was a TA for 7 out of my 8 years here. My last year, I was the meta TA. I don't know, do you guys still have meta TAs? You do, okay. So basically, someone seems to like a meta TA back there. And it was, it was more schlepping as a meta TA than anything I think I have ever done before. The thing that was going on at the time was, as we were just talking about, object-oriented programming was becoming a thing. And so we were looking for how are we going to change the CS11 course to teach object-oriented programming. And we looked around, there were, C++, it's probably a little too complicated to teach in the early years. We looked at a few things. And so Andy, of course, said, okay, well, we don't like any of these, let's write something. So we had Professor Rice rewrite the Pascal compiler into an object-oriented Pascal compiler. We had David Niguidula and me spend basically the entire summer rewriting that book. And we were going through this incredible experience of rewriting the course. When Andy gets a call from Microsoft, and somehow Microsoft found out that we were doing this, and so he calls me into his office and he says, I got a strange call from Microsoft. They say that if we switch our program to start with object-oriented programming for CS11, they're going to stop recruiting at Adobe. At Microsoft. And what should we do? Is it going to be ready? I thought for a minute, and Norm was right. I said, yes, and that was history. We went down this path. It was a crazy path to try and pull off in the 3 months we had to do it, but we did it. And the next year, I left, and Ely had to work on making sure it all worked. But the real story in that for me was the fact that we didn't really know it was going to work. But sometimes you just have to put your head down and move forward and go for it. And that's really been a lesson I've taken with me throughout my life. After Brown, I went to Oracle, and I worked for a Brown grad. After that, I started a company with a Brown grad. After that, I raised money from a Brown grad. Thank you, Norm. After that, I went to join Norm at Macromedia, and now I work at Adobe reporting to our CEO, who has a son who will soon be a Brown grad. So as I was coming here, I was thinking about how amazing this community has been, but the thing I started to wonder in the back of my mind is, would anyone else hire me? And I've decided not to think about that, but rather dwell on the fact that I think what's drawing me to always be surrounded by and working with Brown grads are two really fundamental things I learned in the department. The first is the power of naivete, right? We didn't know what we shouldn't be able to do, and so we were able to do it. And the second was that maybe the most creative moments and maybe the biggest impact comes from people who are truly unqualified to do what they're doing, because that's when you truly have to think in new and innovative ways. So Andy, unbelievable impact you've had on my life and everyone's life, and thank you very much for that.
And we asked David to do a little bit of an experiment on Andy's photos to see how he stays so young.
Yes.
Could Photoshop answer the question, maybe?
Yeah, so we got this picture of Andy, and I think Bob or someone said it earlier, it was just somehow we all aged a year and a half and Andy got younger in the classes. So this was Andy, and we got some forensic scientists that we work with on a regular basis in law enforcement to play with it a little bit. So we asked them, what would this person look like, 3 or 4 years later, and we got this. And you know what, it's pretty accurate. I saw this picture earlier, it's pretty good. Then we said, what would this person look like 25 years later in a high-pressure job? And we got this. And we said, all right, dial it up to 50 years, because this is really what we're celebrating. And it wasn't as flattering as I was expecting, because as you guys know, Andy looks like this. But here's the thing. We then asked the same forensic engineers, what would Andy look like 200 years, if he stayed around for 200 years and taught at Brown? And this is what he came up with. So.
Okay, we skipped me. Okay, so I graduated in 2006. I did 5 years at Brown, 4 of them of coursework and 1 year of research with Andy. This is when I was trying to decide whether to stay in academia or go into industry. And I must say that throughout that entire time, he somehow convinced me to TA 9 out of the 10 semesters, even when I was doing research. 2 of those years were as head TA. I think there's only 1 person in the world, he said, that TA'd CS15 more than me. I TA'd 4 times, 2 as head TA, and then 2 as under. So during my research, we did some application development in Microsoft technology, which then led opening doors to an internship at Microsoft, and then I had a full-time job. So here I am as an incoming senior, and I've got a job. I got some classes that I need to finish up, and I figure I'm just going to coast through my senior year and have some fun. Nope. Andy convinced me to TA again my senior year, and throughout that year, he was the VP of research. He was teaching 2 classes, and he was writing a book. So I did get an acknowledgement in that intro to object-oriented programming book, so that was great. So definitely spent my year doing some fun things there. Andy may not know this, but when I first I visited Brown when I was a junior in high school. It was through a program that took underrepresented minority students from inner city school in Fresno, California, to visit the Ivies and just introduce us to this world that was very foreign and new to us. And so we visited a bunch of the schools. I lived on Brown Avenue in between Princeton and Harvard, and my entire life I thought it was a color. Didn't know, had no idea. I was the first to go to college in my family. My mother immigrated from Mexico, had really no idea what the process even was, and so I, throughout that entire time had to figure out how was I going to get to Brown. Once I visited, I fell in love with it, and I also attended CS22 as a junior in high school to just check it out, and I fell in love with it. And so I decided I was going to come to Brown and major in computer science. I'd heard of Andy, he was a legend. I had met students, and I knew that that's what I wanted to do. So luckily it worked out. I thank my lucky stars. When I say that Andy was an advisor, it really is, he was more of my fairy godmother. I had no idea what I was doing once I got here. I knew that I wanted to do computer science. I wanted to make video games. That was my dream. I was always into video games when I was a kid. And so he taught graphics. And so throughout my entire time here, I really just tried my best to sort of reach those goals of learning as much as possible and also giving back to the department in the same way as they helped me when I was a freshman and really didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I'm grateful for that time that I had. All of the programs from Wix to the research opportunities that we had, we were rewriting courses as a freshman. My summer freshman year, I did a research assistantship in rewriting a course to introduce computer science to non-computer science majors, which was really interesting. I then, after Brown moved on, I spent 5 years at Microsoft. I worked at a couple of startups, went through an IPO, now at Facebook as a product manager there. And so it's been a really incredible ride, and throughout every single step of my career, it was always sprinkled with some other Brown fairy godmother, some person that said, hey, maybe you should apply to this company, or hey, I know that you know so-and-so, why don't you come in for an interview? It always just happened to be that way, and so I'm very grateful for that Brown community and the opportunities and doors that it has opened. So, let's see. Skipped. Okay, so when we were thinking about our stories to share with you, 3 things kept coming up, and that was the fact that the programs and meeting Andy and his influence on us always taught us to give back. We formed a community here, and we always learned to play and make it fun. So in terms of giving back, I don't know if many of you, you're probably if you worked with him or were his TA, you're familiar with the TA dinners. These are these fun traditions at Andy's house. 3 times a year, you come over for a barbecue or you come over for Chinese food, and it's always really fun. It's a great tradition. And when I went to Microsoft, Bill Gates still used to do this as well for interns. He would have them over at his house for a barbecue. And I was like, well, everyone must do this then. And so I'm sad to say that Mark Zuckerberg has not invited me to a barbecue to his house yet, but I'm sure the invitation is on its way. And the other big thing was just the inclusion and diversity that I really felt was strong in the department. When I was here, there were 4 other Hispanic students that were majoring in CS. There were so many women. My TAs were a bunch of them were women, and I felt that the entire time it was just a really good place that welcomed us, that challenged us, and really pushed us to be the best that we could be. So I thought that we could share a couple of stories of how this has impacted our current lives and how we give back. So.
You want me to start?
Yeah.
You want me to start? No, I don't want you to start. So when I left Brown, when I graduated from Brown, I decided to go to Oracle. And I remember this very well because I sat down in Andy's office and I told him I've decided to go to Oracle. And without skipping a beat, Andy looks at me and says, "That's a terrible decision." And I asked him, like we talked about it, and his point was really interesting. It was a question of who I was and what community I wanted to be a part of. And this idea of going to a large company and being a small cog in a big wheel, Andy just felt deeply in his core was not who I was, and it needed to be part of a community that I really could relate to more deeply. Regardless, I decided to go to Oracle. It was actually nice to actually be able to date and, have a life outside of work for a little while. So I went there. But before I went there, I traveled around. Europe, as most graduates do at that time. And I remember I was just brooding on this conversation. I was just feeling like I was making a bad decision. So I sat down, and one night, it was a rainy night. I sat down and wrote myself a letter to my 25-year-old self. Basically recounting this conversation I had with Andy, and saying, if I'm opening this letter on my 25th birthday and I haven't gone and started a company, quit and go do it. And when I turned 25, I opened that letter, I read it. I didn't actually remember exactly what was in it because I think maybe we had had a little to drink that rainy night in Europe. And it was profound. I walked away, I called up Dennis the next day. He was already thinking about doing some stuff, and we went off and we started the company together. And the reason this is important to me in the context of community is that community, in many cases, in many places, I think is overstated in terms of what it means. It almost becomes cult-like. And I think what Andy taught us all was that you can be part of a community, you can give everything to that community, but you can also be an individual, and that community can also be inclusive, very inclusive. And in fact, if there's one other thing I took away in terms of how I define community, is that my community at work, my community outside of work, and my community with my family, it's all one. And if I, just by role modeling how Andy and Debbie lived their lives and how included we all felt in those TA dinners at the house, I walk away feeling like I understand what it means to be a Brown grad. I understand the lessons that Andy taught.
Nabeel?
So when I started taking CS 123 my junior year, I was also head TAing 15, so I felt very much underqualified for everything I was doing that semester. But 123 actually opened a very interesting window into the world for me, and that it showed me that math and technology and fun things like computer games, like Janet mentioned, all of these things were somehow intertwined. And so when I was ray tracing a sphere, a few friends and I realized that there's probably a lot of kids who hate math right now because they don't understand what it can be used to do. They don't understand that the games that they're playing are actually backed by graphics libraries and lots of really challenging but amazing concepts that if they understood, then they might be more interested in learning. And so it's very exciting to hear about a lot of the kind of education technology or computing and education work that a lot of people have done throughout the history of this department. And so that year we started actually going into middle schools in Providence and working with kids to teach them how to code. And this was, I have to claim, before it was cool to teach kids how to code like it is now. So we were very much inspired, I think, by the work of people like Sherm as well, and this is sort of a testament to the broader department of instilling kind of this ethos of taking what we were learning and sharing it with the wider world and trying to get people who are in underprivileged or just otherwise vulnerable circumstances to really believe they have the capacity to learn and that what they're learning is cool. And so that's something that I've carried on for the past several years through grad school, focusing on education technology. I'm actually at Khan Academy right now, focusing on similar things. And so I think that was very much something that stemmed from my time at Brown in particular in Andy's courses, and just feel like very grateful, I think, for the opportunity to now look into other ways to share that community element that's so intertwined with our learning here with people elsewhere.
I would just add something really quick in there. It's because Andy's CS15 and TAing CS15 that I get to know all these people. Nabeel was my TA, and then I TA'd with him. And through him, I actually joined the same learning exchange program that he founded to teach underprivileged kids in Providence math and computer science. And really, ever since I graduated Brown, the friends I made through CS15 and TAing, they remain my best friends, and I keep getting opportunities and doing great things with them ever since. I mean, it's only been 2 years, but.
Yeah, I'll just add, of all the classes I took at Brown in computer science department, which were all fantastic and amazing, the one that sticks out as different from all the others was CS92, which David Niguidula mentioned earlier, because it was a class where we got to go and actually work with students and work with kids and see the impact that what we were doing was having on them. And going from that, I took that my last year, and then went right out to Silicon Valley, mid-90s, been there ever since, through the dot-com boom, through the current craziness. And what's kept me at Macromedia and Adobe for all that time is that with so much going on and so much money flowing around and so much technology, what I love about the place I work and what keeps me there is the mission and the fact that what we get to do is actually go focus on the people who are using our stuff and make sure that kids and everyone else is actually, we are potentially changing their lives with what we do. And all that came out of that CS92 class for me. So.
Awesome. And everything that we did here at Brown, it was fun. Learning, teaching, we had a great time, and Andy was definitely the role model in that. We thought we were superheroes. I certainly thought I was a superhero when I was here and I was a TA. We thought we were definitely invisible, except for one time when we accidentally set off the fire alarm because we were filming a skit. I don't know if you remember this, or maybe Tom, you remember. I think that was probably an $1,800 mistake. We thought it'd be great to use a fog machine. It was a Darth Vader scene. It was really important. We wanted to impress Andy. It didn't turn out all that great, but we have great cuts from that scene. I don't know if you guys know Andy the rapper, but we have a quick clip. Video 3. Oh, 3. Sorry.
Well, hey there. What's your variant of time? Ooh, Boolean, sweet thing. Is it true that Booleans make the best lovers? True! I've got the perfect Java keyword for you. Oh, really? What's that? Package.
I'd like to welcome you all to Brown University's annual talent show. First up, ABD and the Power of 3.
Yo, yo, yo! I got your attention. All you scuzzy MCs ain't got anything on me. On my coat, on my slides. I'm ABD. You can't touch me.
That was awful, Andy. Start from the top. Start again.
Let's see, how does the first one go over? Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay. All right, here we go. Yo, yo, yo. All you sucker MCs ain't got nothing on me, on my code, on my side. I'm ABD. PhD! Oh, yeah. No, I'm a PhD.
So nerd is inferred.
How are you? So nerd is inferred. But never mind what you heard. I'm like James Bond III. Shaken, not stirred. Then, start early, start yesterday. You better not crash.
So that was Andy. And to close out, Andy taught us to be responsible, reliable, dependable. Don't be late, ever. Be creative, solve problems in ways you didn't think of before, help others. Keep things simple, clear, and meaningful. Don't be that guy. Cultivate friendships. Connecting to those around you will lead to enriching professional and personal experiences. Build your community. Always pay it forward. Believe in yourself. Take risks. Don't just be good. Don't just be the best. Be amazing. Thank you, Andy.
At this point, our next speaker needs no introduction. Can you plug me in?
Building CS at Brown, 50 years worth. The rebuttal, closing remarks. If I didn't have a swelled head before, I sure have one after these proceedings. Thanks so much, Tom, for a wonderful job as MC. Thanks to President Paxson and Provost Colvin, and all the panelists for all their remarks and great stories. Their recollections, both real and virtual, and sticking to the maxim that you never should let the facts get in the way of a good story. Our CS department wasn't built in a day, and it sure as hell wasn't built by one person. So I'm going to disagree with President Paxson. I don't like to do that, but it's necessary. This was a team effort, and you all know it. I want to thank my co-founders, Tom Doeppner, Bob Sedgwick, Peter Wegner, John Savage, Eugene Charniak, and Steve Rice. I especially thank them and the more recent faculty for helping to create a department culture that prizes collegiality and implements all that is implied by the phrase, Brown is a university college. That to me means it's one that respects teaching and research equally and treats undergraduates and graduates alike. I also want to recognize some of the other people who were instrumental in building our department. First, Walter Freiberger. He recruited me to Brown into applied math and got the whole thing started. He then became my chairman in the Division of Applied Math. Morris Glicksman, who was the provost, who, somewhat against the wishes of the two divisions, allowed us, in fact, encouraged us to become a department with a mere 7 people. Howard Swearer was our wonderful president at the time, and he also was a fan, and he allowed us to engage in this amazing experiment to see if we could be a department on our own, and helped us do fundraising, which also was done by Frank Wesniak, a trustee of Brown, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. And last, but certainly not least, David McKinney. David, are you in the audience? There you are. David is an amazing fellow. He was the CEO of IBM Europe, and then became the president of the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he was responsible for us developing very close ties and getting amazing amounts of funding from IBM back in the 80s, primarily for our workstation projects, which were carried on in Iris. And that was an effort that was led eventually by Norm Meyrowitz. So I want to recognize, besides these folks, some of the former students who fortunately are here today, so I'm going to leave off a whole bunch who aren't. Steve Carmody, Bob Munck, Ed Lazowska, Marty Michael, Hal Weber, and Norm. And these people, all in their own way, made amazing contributions. But I also want us to take a minute to remember people who are no longer with us. An in memoriam minute, if you will. John Gannon, Bob Wallace, Rick Harrington, Randy Pausch. George Stabler is the fellow way in the back peering over Stark, and in the left side, along with Rick Harrington on the bottom right. David Notkin, who was here, fortunately, still a couple of years ago and gave a wonderful lecture, and the amazing Charles Strauss. Finally, not so finally in my talk, I know I stand between you and drink and food, but I'll have to go a little bit longer. I want to thank Tom again, and especially Lauren Clark, our departmental manager. Lauren, you're the only person I'm going to ask to stand up for a moment. I want you to know that Lauren is running 4 back-to-back major events, each with more than 100 people this week. It is an amazing performance. And her partner is our Jesse Polimas, who has done a wonderful job on publicity, on contacting you, writing a story and multiple stories in Conduit and so on. So you and I owe these people a lot of thanks. And now, last but not least, I want to thank my dear wife, Debbie, and our children for putting up with me all these years. This is us more than 50 years ago, and to the right are our kids in an earlier era. Well, you've heard some of the stories, and I will take just a few minutes to tell you a few more. One of the famous ones is my introduction to Brown. After Walter had hired me, which was in August, it was pretty late. Classes started in early September. And I came to Brown with our then 9-month-old twins and Debbie and the dog. And we moved in, and that was all on the weekend before classes were supposed to start. And I wasn't quite finished with my dissertation. Now I know you're going to find that hard to believe, knowing me. So part of getting ready for classes was also typing yet another draft of the dissertation that was long overdue. So Debbie and I and the twins went down into the basement of the computing lab where my office was, and I found a Selectric typewriter, and Debbie started typing on said Selectric typewriter. And I was starting to get impatient because even though she was a really fast typist and an accurate one, there was just so many pages to type. So I got the brilliant idea of parallel processing, and I looked around to see if I could find another typewriter somewhere. No luck, all the offices were closed. So I knew the engineering building, Barrison Hawley, was right next door, and I might as well try my luck there. Went to the 4th floor, saw a Selectric typewriter, and that little gadget on the right-hand side is called the golf ball, and it was a miraculous invention because it basically allows you to have any font whatsoever by replacing one ball with another. It was great. I found the typewriter, but no ball. And I said, well, the ball's got to be there somewhere. So I went to the desk, tried to open the desk drawer, had trouble with it, took out my trusty Swiss Army knife. Jimmy did very carefully, and then being a good citizen of the community, left the note that I signed that said, "Dear engineering department, I have absconded with your typewriter in order to be able to type a very important document, but I'll have it back promptly at 9 o'clock in the morning." At about 8:35, I showed up for the first day of class, and there was a note in my mailbox, my very first note at Brown. That was great, and I opened it up, and it was from the chairman, and it said, "See me immediately," with about 6 exclamation points. And I thought, wow, that's a really strong welcome. Okay. So I walked into his office, and he said, "Have you got a typewriter that belongs to engineering?" And I said, "Yeah." And I was about to return it well in time for 9 o'clock. And he said, "Do you know that they start at 8:30? And I said, "No, I didn't." He said, "Return that typewriter instantly and come back when you've done it." So kind of nervously, I walked into the engineering building where the secretary, who turned out to be the dean's administrative assistant, I didn't know that I'd taken her personal typewriter, was sitting there not very happy, glowering at me. I returned the typewriter, apologized profusely, walked back to applied math, went into the chairman's office, and he started lecturing me about it's not community property, it belongs to departments and divisions. And as he was lecturing me and I was feeling very uncomfortable, I started noticing that there was kind of a smile creeping up on his face. And finally, he burst out laughing. And he said, "You know, if you're ever going to do that again, get it from religious studies." It wasn't until quite a few weeks later when I started absorbing the politics of the institution that I recognized that he and the dean of engineering were not the best of friends. So that was not a good introduction to Brown. Second story, much briefer. We like to have fun, as you know. So when David Nanian was my head TA along with Michael Strickman, I knew it was David's birthday, and I decided to treat him to a bellygram. And so at the agreed upon time, right in the middle of the lecture, the belly dancer came in and did a wonderful little dance in which he involved David. David, are you in the audience? Where are you? All right, great. He turned beet red, even though this is part of his ethnic background. And he did his best. It was a little lame, but okay, he pulled it off. And I thought that had been great fun, and the class clearly loved it. Oh, we roll forward about a month or so. It's near the end of the semester. And I go into my class in Wilson, and about a third of the class is present. And after a little while, I get impatient, and I say to David and Mike, "Where the hell is the class?" And they said, "No idea, don't know." So finally, I decided there was nothing for it but to start lecturing, and I did. And about a third of the way into the lecture, the Brown band trooped in, playing Happy Birthday. So I figured he got me back. That was great. Final story, and it's a little bit about the milieu that you've heard so much about. We did a lot of hardware back in the old days when you couldn't get stuff commodity. And we did a lot of microprogramming, and one of the peripherals we built was designed by Andy Markowitz. He's in the audience, a great engineer, and it was called the Markowitz Magic Matrix Multiplier, or M4, and it gave us much higher performance than the native hardware could. Well, it did very well, but it was hardwired. It couldn't be programmed, and there was this guy named Tom Banshoff who was exploring the fourth dimension, and if you're going to do four-dimensional transformations, you need a matrix engine that does that. 3D isn't good enough. You need 4D, and we wanted it to be microprogrammable. To cut to the chase, there's wonderful engineering student, Hal Weber. Hal, are you in the audience? I didn't see you yet. Where is Hal? There. Convinced me that we could build what I wanted, which was a writable control store, microprogrammable computer that would do four-dimensional math as well as three-dimensional math, and do it at blinding speed using a new technology called MECL, Motorola ECL, emitter-coupled logic, which was just then coming into vogue, and there wasn't a lot of experience with it. So we talked a lot about whether this kind of very ambitious design was possible. And after a while, I could see Hal, who at the best of times was kind of a curmudgeon. Hal, you've mellowed, it's great. Getting more and more impatient with me as I was pushing on him and challenging him, and at some point, I pulled out this paper by Charlie Molnar, who was one of the distinguished computer architects in the 70s, and he had written this paper about the use of Motorola ECL and all the problems that it had because it was such an exotic technology. Think British race car, fast, but boy, you can't count on it to start necessarily. And he also had discovered that there was this timing problem called the St. Louis glitch. And anyhow, it made me bloody nervous because we were going to spend something like $20,000, that was big money in those days, to build what was called the simile. It's in our computer museum. And after a while, Hal just lost it with me, and he said, okay, goddammit, who are you going to believe, this so-called worldwide expert or me? Make up your mind. Well, what could I do? Of course, I bet my $20K on him. He pulled it off. It never failed to the best of my knowledge, except for some lights burning out. Is that approximately right, Hal? As I said, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. All right, so just a little more about hardware and then I'll wrap up. You've heard about the march of going from a 512K machine for the entire university to private computers, time-shared and everything. And I remember that one of the great events in our communal life was when we got an additional 32K of memory for our multiprocessor graphics system, bringing us all the way up to 64K, and we got a 1 megabyte platter. We held a champagne party because it was that important. Okay, many more stories, time does not permit. So let me cut to the chase and tell you what in my 50 years I'm proudest of. Let me exhibit a little parental pride. Over 50 former and current teachers, former and current department chairs, including Fram Tompa from Waterloo, who's here, Bob Sedgwick, Princeton, who was here earlier, Ed Lazowska, and David Notkin, who were chairs at UW, John Gannon, University of Maryland, John Guttag at MIT, Jack Stankovic, University of Virginia, and our latest chair, Ken Sloan at University of Alabama. But not just in academe did our grads make their mark. And again, these were not just my students, they were the department's students. Let's not forget that. In industry, Diane Schechter-Pozevsky, a networking guru and IBM fellow who's now teaching at UNC, John Crawford, whom you heard about earlier, Bob Wallace, who was one of the co-founders of Microsoft and is in that seminal picture, Brad Silverberg, Will Poole, and Eric Rudder, who held very high positions at Microsoft. Mary Fernandez and Ingrid Carlbom at AT&T and Bell Labs. Peter Norvik at Google. David Salesin in Adobe Research. And David Wadhwani in Adobe Research, just among the few who have really made their mark. And not just because of what they learned at Brown, but because of their innate quality across the spectrum. One of the most wonderful things in my life is to have academic grandkids come and take my courses, and I'm going to wrap up by showing you 3 wonderful progeny pictures. Michael, as I mentioned, was a head TA, and then I stole his son Ian from chemistry, and he became a head TA. You already saw David, and you probably didn't see his daughter, Carlene, but she's also TAing for me this fall as well as working in my research group. And finally, Karen and Emma Catlin, and Emma will be a TA in CS15. This is what makes me keep doing what I'm doing. So let me wrap up by saying I hope you'll all be excited about contributing to this permanent UTA endowment. I'm pleased to announce that Debbie and I will be making a significant contribution, and I hope you guys will match us. And I want to thank you all for coming to this event and for being part of this eventful journey. May it long continue. Thank you.
Andy, we're not through with you yet. Paul, Barb.
we're testing your patience. Sitzfleisch.
All right. The best things come in unmarked cardboard boxes. No, not this time. I'll just share a really quick anecdote. When, in the spring of 1980, I was interviewing to be a CS51 TA, and I was standing on the landing outside Andy's office in Kassar House, and the person in front of me came out and said, "There's no place to sit." I was like, oh, that's so awkward. How am I going to do the interview? But it wasn't a problem because Andy burst through the door and said, "Walk with me." You've all had that experience, right? So I had no idea what walk with me meant 35 years later today. Paul?
So we're going to present Andy with a couple of things. The first thing is a memory book. We got lots of people to contribute photographs and stories and anecdotes. That is being printed. So today we're just promising Andy that we will give him the memory book. We also made a couple of artifacts, one for Andy and one for the department. And so explain a little bit about these artifacts.
Okay, so when Tom and Ura asked me to procure some kind of plaque to commemorate this, I thought, plaque, Andy? That's so boring. And I immediately thought of the middle school robotics competitions where the trophies at the end of the competition are made of Lego. And that seems entirely appropriate because the actual building tools for the Lego robotics competition is the Lego. So I found an artist in California who would create some kind of trophy / award / plaque that would be the tools that Andy has worked with over the years. So these are from, this is Andy's tool set. So wow. Grab this so you can follow along. So the theme here is Andy's tool set. This desktop sculpture includes a Selectric type ball. So Andy, you will never be without your ball in the future. So to speak. A couple small computer modules from Brown's original IBM 360. Wow. So Rob Gerwitz, Rob, are you around somewhere? Yes. Rob has been safekeeping these for a long, long time, not sure why. There's also transistors, vacuum tubes, an oscilloscope CRT part, a flowchart template, 4-color pen, and of course, most importantly, chopsticks.
Yay! Fabulous.
All right, so these gifts are also there from the department and the alums, and like all generous groups, we give and then we take back 37%. So this wall plaque will be hanging in the CS department. This other part is for Andy to do whatever he wants with. Maybe he'll actually build something new with it. The base of the wall plaque is the original J logic board from the Metaphor mini computer that drove bugs.
Oh, man.
On top of this is the dial, yes, dial, from an ancient telecommunications device, yes, the desktop telephone. Everything is surrounded by the ubiquitous punch cards that Andy used to carry in his pocket. Andy, we hope you enjoy this collection of your tools. The inscription on these sculptures say it best. Thank you, Andy, for inspiring us to build things never before imagined.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. That's bloody brilliant. Thank you so much, all of you who had a hand in that. I love it. Thank you. Let's drink and eat in that order.